Eleanor Whitmore did not cry when her husband told her to kneel. She did not tremble. She did not beg. She reached up, unclasped the pearl necklace Nathaniel had placed around her throat on their wedding morning, and set it down on the banquet table, like a woman returning something that had never truly belonged to her. Then she walked out of the most elegant ballroom in Virginia, head straight, shoulders steady, while 300 people watched in stunned silence. If you've ever had to choose between your pride and your peace, stay with me. Subscribe, follow this story to the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Virginia, summer of 1816. The morning of the Whitmore summer reception. Eleanor rose before the household did. She dressed herself without calling for her maid. She moved through the upper corridor of Whitmore Manor in the gray pre-dawn quiet, checking that the flower arrangements had been refreshed, that the silver on the long dining tables had been properly polished, that the musicians hired for the evening had received their written instructions. She had been doing this for 11 months, managing a household that did not feel like hers, living inside a marriage that functioned like a business arrangement and nothing more. She told herself it would change. She had been telling herself that since the week after the wedding, when Nathaniel Caldwell Whitmore had shaken her father's hand in the parlor, signed the papers that merged what remained of the Whitmore fortune with her family's modest landholdings, and then spent the entire wedding supper in quiet conversation with his solicitor at the far end of the table, leaving Eleanor to sit beside his elderly cousin and make conversation about crop rotations. She had laughed it off then. She was laughing less these days. By late afternoon, the manor had transformed. Carriages arrived in a steady procession up the long gravel drive. Women in pale summer gowns stepped down with gloved hands and practiced smiles. Men in dark coats and tall hats exchanged greetings on the front steps with the kind of easy confidence that came from never once having had to wonder whether they belonged somewhere. Eleanor stood near the entrance for 2 hours, welcoming every guest, speaking each name with warmth, guiding conversations, smoothing over the small awkwardnesses that always arose when Virginia's oldest families gathered in the same room. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. It was the one thing she had noticed Nathaniel never acknowledged, that without her, his social calendar would collapse inside a month. That without her quiet organizational precision, the Whitmore estate ran like a wagon with a broken wheel. That without her presence, charming and steady and unobtrusive, his family name would have cost him at least 4 significant business partnerships in the past year alone. He didn't see it, or maybe he saw it and simply did not consider it worth mentioning. She wasn't sure which was worse. Caroline Beaumont arrived at 7:30. Eleanor recognized her from across the room before she'd fully stepped through the door. Caroline was 30 years old and had been a widow for 3 of them, and she wore her freedom the way some women wore fine jewelry, with deliberate, studied elegance. Her gown was deep gold. Her hair was dressed with small ivory flowers. She moved through the room like someone who had already decided it belonged to her. Eleanor had heard the name for months. She had heard it spoken in lowered voices between the kitchen staff. She had seen it written twice in letters she had not been meant to find. Correspondence between Nathaniel and his solicitor that made reference to certain financial consultations with the Beaumont widow regarding her late husband's estates. She had filed it away. She was good at filing things away. What she had not expected was the way Caroline crossed the ballroom that evening with perfect, unhurried confidence and came to stand directly beside Nathaniel. Not behind him, not at a polite social distance, but beside him, her shoulder nearly touching his arm, as though she had rehearsed the placement and found it satisfactory. And Nathaniel did not step away. Eleanor watched from across the room. She picked up a glass of lemonade from a passing tray and held it without drinking, and watched her husband smile at another woman in a way he had not smiled at her since before the wedding. Something settled inside her chest then. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. Something that felt like the last thread of a long patience finally pulling free. The incident happened at 9 o'clock. Eleanor had moved to the far side of the ballroom to speak with Mrs. Holloway, the wife of one of Nathaniel's oldest business associates, when she heard Caroline Beaumont's voice cut cleanly through the general noise of the gathering. "I'm sorry. I simply cannot let this go without saying something." The room didn't stop all at once. It slowed. Conversations dropped in volume. Heads turned. Caroline stood at the center of the room, with one gloved hand pressed lightly to her collarbone, the gesture of a woman performing wounded dignity. "Mrs. Whitmore told me earlier this evening," Caroline said, "that the financial trouble my late husband left behind was something I had brought upon myself, that I ought to have managed my affairs more carefully instead of expecting other people's charity." There was a murmur. Eleanor went very still. She had said no such thing. She had barely spoken 20 words to Caroline Beaumont all evening. She had greeted her at arrival, complimented her gown, and then moved on. The conversation had lasted perhaps 90 seconds. She turned to look at the woman across the room. "I didn't say that." Caroline's expression shifted into something that looked almost like sorrow. "I understood what you meant, Mrs. Whitmore, even if the exact words were softer. I didn't say that," Eleanor repeated. Her voice was steady. "I didn't say anything close to that." The room was very quiet now. Mrs. Holloway, standing beside Eleanor, touched her arm lightly, a gesture that was half comfort and half warning. And then Nathaniel came forward. Eleanor watched him cross the floor. She watched the expression on his face, the tight jaw, the careful eyes, the look she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he had already made a decision and was simply crossing the distance to deliver it. He stopped between them. He looked at Eleanor. "This has caused a scene," he said, low, even. "In front of our guests." "She is lying," Eleanor said. "I didn't say those things. I greeted her at the door. That was the whole of our conversation. Caroline is a respected woman in this county. I am your wife." Something flickered across his face. Whatever it was, it did not last long enough to become a defense of her. "My wife," Nathaniel said slowly, "should know better than to create conflict at an occasion like this. Whatever was said, or not said, the right thing is to apologize and let this evening continue without further embarrassment." Eleanor looked at him. The room was absolutely silent. She could feel 300 pairs of eyes on the back of her neck, on the line of her shoulders, on her face. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on every person in that ballroom. The anticipation of what she would do. The silent expectation that she would do what women in her position always did. Bow her head. Find the words. Make the discomfort go away. She had been making discomfort go away for 11 months. "You want me," Eleanor said. And she was surprised by how calm she sounded, surprised by how her voice carried through the room without cracking. "To apologize to this woman for something I did not say." "I want you," Nathaniel said, "to conduct yourself with the dignity this family's name requires." Silence. Then Eleanor said, very quietly, "No." She heard the word leave her mouth, and it didn't feel like defiance. It didn't feel like rage or pride or a declaration of any kind. It felt like exhaling after holding her breath for 11 months. "I will not apologize for a lie," she said. "And I will not do it in front of your guests or anyone else." Nathaniel's eyes went flat. "Eleanor, I have managed this home. I have managed your accounts. I have managed every social obligation this family carries, without being asked and without being thanked." She kept her voice low, but she did not lower her eyes. "The one thing I will not manage is my own public humiliation." The silence that followed was absolute. She reached up and unclasped the pearl necklace. It had been a wedding gift. Nathaniel's mother's pearls, handed to him on the morning of their marriage, which he had placed around her throat with what she had believed, in her romantic foolishness, was something close to tenderness. She set it on the nearest table. She smoothed the front of her gown, and she walked away. The night air outside was warm and thick with summer, and Eleanor walked down the front steps of Whitmore Manor and kept walking until the sound of the reception faded behind her, and she was standing on the long gravel drive with the dark Virginia sky above her and the lights of the manor behind her. She had no bag, no plan. The carriage she had arrived in would not leave without Nathaniel's instruction, and she had no intention of going back inside to make arrangements like a sensible woman. She stood in the dark and breathed. After a while, she heard footsteps on the gravel. Not Nathaniel's. She knew his tread. It was Samuel Grant, 60 years old, gray-haired, the Whitmore estate's head steward. He had worked for Nathaniel's father for 30 years and had watched Eleanor arrive at the manor with the careful, quiet attention of a man who observed everything and said very little. He stopped a respectful distance behind her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "My sister lives on Morrow Lane, 3 miles east. She takes in guests sometimes." Eleanor didn't turn around. "She's a decent woman," Samuel continued. "Keeps a clean house, doesn't ask questions." A long pause. "I can arrange the carriage without anyone noticing, ma'am, if that's something you'd want." Eleanor stood very still in the summer dark. Then she said, "Yes, thank you, Samuel." She heard him move back toward the stables. She turned and looked at the manor one more time. The light in all the windows. The sound of conversation and music she could barely hear from here. The home she had spent 11 months trying to make feel like hers. She picked up her skirts and followed Samuel to the carriage. She spent the night at the home of Samuel's sister, a quiet widow named Martha, who asked her nothing, gave her a room with a good window, and brought her tea and cold biscuits without being asked. Eleanor sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the floor for a long time. She had been patient. She had been careful. She had believed. And she recognized now with a clarity that felt like cold water. She had believed that patience was a kind of love. That if she served well enough, managed capably enough, caused no trouble and made no demands, Nathaniel would eventually look up from whatever consumed him and see her standing there. She had been waiting for a man to choose to see her. And tonight, he had looked right at her, in front of every family that mattered in Virginia, and chosen something else. The clarity of it was almost a relief. She was done waiting. In the morning, she sent a letter to her Aunt Clara. Clara Whitmore was her mother's older sister, 70 years old, sharp-minded, widowed young and self-sufficient ever since. She kept a small house in a village 40 miles south of the Whitmore estate, surrounded by her books and her garden, and her complete indifference to the opinions of Virginia society. Eleanor had loved her aunt since childhood. She was the only woman in Eleanor's life who had ever told her the truth without softening at first. The letter was brief. "I have left Nathaniel's house. I am well. I would like to come to you if the invitation stands. There are things I need to think through, and I think better near you than anywhere else I know." The reply came before sundown. "Come at once. I will have your room ready. Bring nothing you don't need." She was at Clara's house by the following afternoon. Clara met her at the door, looked her over once, top to bottom, the practiced assessment of a woman who had spent a lifetime reading situations quickly, and then stood aside to let her in. "You look like someone who hasn't slept," Clara said. "I haven't." "Good." Clara closed the door behind her. "Sleep is what people do when they've decided to stop thinking. You've got more thinking ahead of you." Eleanor almost laughed. She followed her aunt into the kitchen, where a pot of something was on the fire, and the smell of it was warm and grounding in a way that made the tight thing in her chest loosen slightly. Clara sat her down at the table and put a bowl in front of her. "Tell me what happened," Clara said. Eleanor told her. Clara listened without interrupting, which was unusual. She sat with her hands folded on the table, and her gray eyes steady on Eleanor's face, and she did not offer a single word until Eleanor finished. Then she said, "Did you love him?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I thought I could." "That's not the same thing." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It isn't." Clara was quiet. Then, "And now?" Eleanor looked at the bowl in front of her. "Now I want to understand what's actually happening. Not what I've been told is happening. What is actually happening?" Clara tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" "The financial records," Eleanor said. "The letters I wasn't supposed to see. Samuel told me once, in passing, the way he says most things, that the accounts aren't balanced the way they should be. He said it like he was talking about the weather and then moved on. But I've been thinking about it for 4 months. She looked up at her aunt. "Caroline Beaumont has been in correspondence with the Whitmore family solicitor. Nathaniel trusts that man completely. And there are 3 property transactions from the past year that don't match any expense or improvement I've seen. Clara was looking at her differently now. I know what records are kept and where, Eleanor continued. I know the estate's accounting system because I reorganized it 6 months after we married. Because it was a disaster, and Nathaniel didn't have time to fix it. He let me because it kept me occupied. A pause. He didn't realize I was reading everything in the process. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire. Clara unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table. What do you need? She said. Time, Eleanor said. And someone who knows a lawyer I can trust. Clara nodded, once, slowly. I know too, she said. I'll write to both of them today. What Eleanor had not yet told her aunt, what she was only beginning to articulate clearly even to herself, was the full scope of what she suspected. She had found the first letter by accident. 7 months ago, during the reorganization of the estate's correspondence files, she had come across a folded sheet tucked into the back of a ledger dated 2 years prior. It was in Caroline Beaumont's handwriting. She recognized it because the same hand had sent a brief social note to the manor a week after Eleanor's arrival, which she had been given to respond to. The letter was short, friendly even, but it referenced a financial arrangement. A transfer of funds from the Whitmore estate accounts into a holding account whose name Eleanor did not recognize. And it referred, in a single careful line, to our agreement regarding the Carter parcels, which was Eleanor's family name, and which referred, she now understood, to the land holdings that had been bundled into the marriage contract. She had put the letter back exactly where she found it. She had told no one. She had gone back to the estate files 3 more times in the months that followed, working slowly and carefully, taking nothing, removing nothing, but reading everything she could reach and memorizing what mattered. The picture she had assembled was incomplete, but it was large enough to be frightening. The Whitmore family solicitor, a man named Aldrich Fenn, had been managing a series of small financial diversions from the estate accounts for at least 3 years. The amounts were not dramatic individually, but across 30 separate transactions, they totaled a sum that would have been significant even to a wealthy family. And woven through the correspondence, always at the edge of the frame, always careful never to appear directly, was Caroline Beaumont. Eleanor did not yet know the full shape of it, but she knew enough to understand that what had happened to her in that ballroom was not merely a social humiliation. It was a distraction, and she had not been the target. The estate had. That evening, after Clara had gone to bed, Eleanor sat at the small writing desk in the corner of the guest room and opened the notebook she had carried with her from the manor. She had started keeping it 4 months ago. Inside were dates, figures, names, and careful transcriptions of everything she had memorized from the estate files. Every transaction that didn't balance. Every reference to names she couldn't place. Every letter that shouldn't have been where she found it. She spread the pages out on the desk and stared at them for a long time. Outside, the summer night was full of crickets. She had left the manor with nothing. No bag, no money, no plan. But she had this notebook. And she had 11 months of silence that everyone in Virginia had mistaken for weakness. She picked up her pen. She began to write. 3 days after she left, Nathaniel sent a letter. She read it standing in Clara's kitchen, while her aunt pretended to be occupied with the garden through the window. Eleanor, your absence from the manor has been noted and is causing comment. I would ask that you return before this situation becomes something it does not need to be. Whatever disagreement occurred at the reception can be addressed privately. I am a reasonable man, and I am willing to listen. Please come home. She folded it carefully. She set it on the kitchen table. Clara came back inside without the garden basket she had gone out supposedly to fetch and looked at the letter without touching it. What does it say? Clara asked. That my absence is causing comment, Eleanor said. Clara said nothing for a moment. Then, what are you going to do? Eleanor picked up the letter. She carried it to the fireplace. She held it over the flame until it caught, and then she placed it on the iron grate and watched it burn. I'm going to finish what I started, she said. She went back to the writing desk. She did not write back. Samuel Grant arrived 4 days later. He came alone, on horseback, without announcement, and knocked at Clara's door in the mid-morning like a man who had thought carefully about what he was going to say and intended to say only that. Clara brought him to Eleanor in the small sitting room. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands. "I rode out without Mr. Whitmore knowing," he said. "I want you to understand that first." "I understand," Eleanor said. "Sit down, Samuel." He sat. He placed his hat on his knee. Then he said, "Mr. Fenn came to the manor 2 days after you left. Spent 4 hours with Mr. Whitmore in the study. Closed doors." Eleanor kept her expression still. "What were they discussing?" "I couldn't hear most of it," Samuel said. "But I heard enough." He looked at his hat. "They're talking about the Carter land parcels, the ones your family brought into the marriage. Mr. Fenn is telling Mr. Whitmore that the titles need to be reclassified under a different legal structure." He paused. "The kind of structure where the wife's family origin of the land stops being relevant to the ownership." The room was quiet. "In other words," Eleanor said slowly, "they want to erase the fact that the land came from my family." "That's what it sounded like to me," Samuel said. He was looking at her steadily now, with the expression of a man who had made a decision and arrived at peace with it. "I've worked for the Whitmore family for 30 years, he said. "I worked for Mr. Whitmore's father. He was a good man. He'd be ashamed of what's happening in that house." A beat. "I don't have papers or letters to give you. I couldn't take anything. But I know what I heard, and I know what I've seen, and I'm willing to say it." Eleanor held his gaze. "Samuel," she said, "what you're offering to do could cost you your position." "My position," Samuel said, "under the current management, ain't worth what it used to be." He put his hat back on his head. "You treated that house like it was a living thing worth caring for. You knew the names of every man and woman on that property. You knew which tenants had sick children and which fields needed draining before the rains came." He shook his head. "Nobody else in that manor noticed any of that. Just you." He stood up. "Whatever you need from me," he said, "you've got it." By the end of the first week at Clara's house, Eleanor had filled 12 pages of her notebook. She had begun to map the full picture, not just the financial irregularities, but the pattern beneath them. The way each transaction had been timed, the way correspondence flowed, the way Caroline Beaumont always appeared at the edge of events, never directly attached to anything, always connected through someone else. It was meticulous work. It was also, she recognized with a quiet astonishment, the most purposeful she had felt since before she married. She had spent 11 months making herself small. Useful, yes. Capable, yes. But small. She had shaped herself around the outline of what Nathaniel needed, and called it love, and called it patience, and told herself it was virtue. She understood now that she had simply been afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of disappointment. Afraid that if she asked for too much, she would lose the little she had. She was done being afraid of that. She had nothing left to lose. And that, she was discovering, was a remarkable kind of freedom. The lawyer Clara had written to arrived on a Thursday morning. His name was Thomas Rowe. He was 65 years old, white-haired, with the deliberate, unhurried manner of a man who had spent 4 decades watching other people make expensive mistakes and had stopped being surprised by them. He sat across from Eleanor in Clara's sitting room and listened without interruption while she walked him through everything. The records, the letters, the transactions, the pattern she had assembled from memory. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How certain are you of these figures?" "Completely," Eleanor said. "I reorganized the estate's accounting records myself. I spent 3 months with those files." He nodded. "And the correspondence. You read it, but you didn't remove it." "I left everything exactly where I found it." "Good." He tapped his fingers on his knee once. "That was very good judgment." He looked at her. "Mrs. Whitmore, what you're describing, if it can be substantiated, is not a minor matter. We are talking about systematic fraud against the estate, possible forgery of property documents, and a conspiracy involving at least one solicitor of record." He paused. "This would be damaging to your husband's name." My husband's name, Eleanor said, is currently being used to legitimize the theft of my family's land. A pause. I'd like to give him the opportunity to understand that before anyone else does. Thomas Rowe looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, Mrs. Whitmore. Let's talk about how we proceed." Outside the sitting room window, the Virginia summer was green and gold and blazing. Eleanor sat straight in her chair and talked through everything she knew with a man who was finally, for the first time since this began, taking notes. She thought about the ballroom. She thought about the moment Nathaniel had looked at her and chosen to look away. She thought about the night she had removed her pearls and walked out of his house and stood in the dark on the gravel drive and breathed. She had walked away from that room believing she had nothing. She understood now what she had been carrying all along. She had the truth. She had always had the truth. And very soon, she was going to bring it back to the room where she had been told to be silent. Thomas Rowe left Clara's house that Thursday afternoon with 12 pages of Eleanor's notes tucked inside his coat and a promise to return within the week. Eleanor stood at the door and watched his carriage roll down the lane, and for the first time since she had walked out of the Whitmore ballroom, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, not confidence. Fear. Real, cold, practical fear. The kind that arrives not when something is going wrong, but when something is finally going right, and you understand, all at once, exactly how much you are risking. She had a lawyer. She had Samuel. She had 12 pages of figures and dates and names memorized with the precision of a woman who had spent 11 months with nothing to do but pay attention. And she had no idea whether any of it would be enough. She closed the door and went back to the writing desk, and she did not sleep well that night. Clara found her still at the desk at 5:30 in the morning. The older woman stood in the doorway of the guest room in her dressing gown and looked at Eleanor without surprise, the way she looked at most things, as though she had already considered the situation and arrived at her assessment before she entered the room. "You've been here all night," Clara said. "I've been thinking." "I can see that." Clara came in and sat on the edge of the bed. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor set down her pen. "Whether I've made a mistake." "Which part?" "Trusting Thomas Rowe." She turned to face her aunt. "I don't know him. I know he's your contact. I know he has a reputation. But I've handed him everything I have, everything I've been building for 4 months, and I have no way of knowing what he's going to do with it." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "His wife was cheated out of her inheritance by a dishonest solicitor. 30 years ago, before he was a lawyer himself. He spent 20 years making sure it never happened to anyone else he could reach." A pause. "He told me that story the first time we met. I don't think he told it to make me trust him. I think he told it because it's the only reason he does what he does." Eleanor looked at her aunt. "That's not a guarantee," she said. "No," Clara agreed. "It isn't, but it's a reason." She folded her hands in her lap. "Eleanor, you have spent 11 months being careful about the wrong things. You were careful not to offend, careful not to demand, careful not to be too much." She held her niece's gaze. "It is time to be careful about the things that actually matter." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Samuel came back 4 days later. He arrived in the early evening, tied his horse to the post at the end of Clara's lane, and knocked at the kitchen door rather than the front. The instinct of a man who had spent his life understanding which entrances were appropriate for people in his position. Clara let him in. Eleanor was already at the kitchen table. Samuel sat down. He was carrying something this time, a folded piece of paper, held carefully at the edges, like a man who understood he was transporting something fragile. "I found this behind the third drawer of Mr. Fenn's traveling case," he said. "He left it at the manor 2 visits back. I don't think he knows it fell out." He placed it on the table. Eleanor reached for it. It was a copy, not an original, but a carefully hand-rendered copy, of a deed transfer. The property described was a parcel of 40 acres in the southern quarter of the Carter family holdings. The transfer listed the receiving party as a land holding company Eleanor had never heard of. The date on the transfer was 3 months before her wedding. 3 months before, she started. Before the marriage contract was signed, Samuel said. Yes, ma'am. Eleanor set the paper down very carefully. They transferred the land before I even married into the family, she said. It looks that way. Which means the land my family brought into the marriage was already gone, Samuel said, or was in the process of being moved. The marriage contract listed those parcels as assets of the Whitmore estate. But if this transfer went through first, then my family signed a marriage contract that included land that had already been quietly moved out of the estate. Eleanor looked up. And my father had no idea. The kitchen was absolutely still. Samuel, Eleanor said, and her voice had gone very quiet in the way it went quiet when she was not allowing herself to react yet. Do you understand what this means? It means the fraud goes back further than any of us thought, he said. And it means Mr. Whitmore may not be the one who started it. She sent for Thomas Rowe the following morning. He arrived by midday. She put the copied deed on the table in front of him without preamble. He read it twice. Then he placed it down very carefully, the way Samuel had, and he looked at Eleanor across the table with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something between professional gravity and genuine alarm. Where did this come from? He asked. From Aldrich Fenn's traveling case, Eleanor said. He left it behind at the manor. Samuel found it. Samuel retrieved this from a solicitor's personal effects. He found it on the floor behind a drawer, Eleanor said. He didn't search anything. It had fallen. Thomas Rowe was quiet for a moment, weighing this. Then, the transfer date. 3 months before my wedding, which means the property was moved before the marriage contract was executed. He tapped the paper once with his finger. If this is accurate, and I will need to verify it against the county deed records, then what we have is not simply internal estate fraud. What we have is a premeditated property scheme that used your marriage as its cover. They used the marriage contract to legitimize land they had already stolen, Eleanor said. My family's parcels were listed as estate assets in the marriage agreement. But if the transfer had already happened, then they were not estate assets. They were already gone. Thomas Rowe sat back. And your father signed a contract based on a false accounting of what the Whitmore estate actually held. He shook his head slowly. Mrs. Whitmore, this is a significant legal matter. I know, Eleanor said. That's why I'm sitting here talking to you instead of sitting in Nathaniel's parlor arranging flowers. Thomas Rowe looked at her. For the first time since they had met, he smiled. Brief, controlled, and entirely genuine. I'll ride to the county records office tomorrow, he said. If the deed transfer is registered there, we have documentary evidence. If it isn't registered, if it was never filed, that tells us something else entirely. He picked up his hat from the chair beside him. Either way, we'll have something to work with. How long? Eleanor asked. 2 days, maybe 3. He stood. Mrs. Whitmore, I want to say something. She looked at him. I've been practicing law for 40 years, he said. I have sat across from a great many women in circumstances not unlike yours. Women who came to me frightened, or confused, or entirely dependent on whatever I could piece together from a few remembered conversations. He paused. I have never sat across from a woman who came to me with 12 pages of organized financial analysis and a preemptively located deed copy. Another pause. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that you have done the hard work already. What I'm doing is following the path you built. Eleanor held his gaze. Thank you, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. After he left, she sat at the table for a long time and didn't move. She was not, she told herself, going to cry in Clara's kitchen. She waited until she was alone in the guest room to do that. On the 9th day after she left the manor, a second letter arrived from Nathaniel. This one was different in tone from the first. The first had been controlled, measured. The letter of a man who expected compliance and was giving it a reasonable deadline. This one was shorter. Eleanor. Your continued absence from this household is damaging to both our reputations and to the management of the estate. I do not understand the nature of your grievance beyond what occurred at the reception, and I am willing to discuss it rationally if you will return. However, I must be direct. I cannot conduct my affairs properly without the organizational systems you maintain. Please come home. N.W. She read it twice. She carried it to Clara's sitting room. He says he can't conduct his affairs without the organizational systems I maintain, she said. Clara looked up from her book. He said that. Those were his words. Not, I miss you. Not, I was wrong. Not, I am sorry. Clara set down her book. He said he needs his filing system back. Essentially. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said very dryly, well, at least he's honest. Eleanor sat down across from her aunt. She folded the letter in half. He doesn't know, she said. Does he? Know what? What Fenn has been doing. What Caroline is involved in. He doesn't know. She looked at the folded letter in her hands. He's sitting in that house conducting his affairs and trusting his solicitor and having no idea that the ground underneath him has been eaten out. You think he's innocent? Clara asked carefully. I think he's oblivious, Eleanor said. Which is not the same thing, but it matters. She looked up. If he's been deliberately complicit, then what I do next is one thing. If he is genuinely unaware, then he is still the man who told you to apologize in front of 300 people, Clara said, not unkindly. Yes, Eleanor said. He is that. She placed the letter on the side table. But a man can be a fool and still not be a criminal, she said. And I am not going to let him be destroyed by other people's crimes if I can prevent it. She paused. Especially not when those crimes involve my family's land. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Eleanor, she said, you are a more generous woman than I would be. I'm not being generous, Eleanor said. I'm being accurate. She stood up. There's a difference. Thomas Rowe returned on a Tuesday. He came in the morning, sat down at Clara's kitchen table, opened the leather satchel he carried, and laid 3 documents on the table. The deed transfer, he said, tapping the first, is registered at the county office, which means it was formally filed, which means it is a legal instrument. He tapped the second document. However, the receiving party, this land-holding company, does not appear in any business registry in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Eleanor looked at him. It doesn't exist. It does not exist as a legally registered entity, Thomas Rowe said, which means the transfer of your family's 40 acres went to a company that exists only on paper. A shell, Eleanor said. A vehicle, he said carefully, for moving property off the estate in a way that looks legal at a glance but does not, under close examination, hold up. He tapped the third document. I've also had a colleague in Richmond pull the transaction records for 2 of the financial transfers you identified in your notes. Both of them run through the same receiving account, an account held under a name I recognized. He slid the third document toward her. Eleanor read the name. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Caroline Beaumont's late husband. Not Caroline Beaumont herself, Thomas Rowe said. The account is in the name of the Beaumont estate, which means it was established when her husband was still living. But the transaction authorizations are signed after his death. He paused. By the estate executor. Who is? Aldrich Fenn, he said. The kitchen was entirely silent. Eleanor set the document down. She understood the full shape of it now, finally, all at once. The thing she had been mapping from the edges inward for 4 months. The thing that had never quite come into focus until this moment. Fenn had been managing the Beaumont estate accounts since the husband's death. He had also been managing the Whitmore estate accounts since before Nathaniel inherited. He sat at the center of both families' financial lives, and he had been using that position to move money and property from one to the other, using the Beaumont estate as the receiving vessel, all while Caroline, charming, socially powerful, always at the edge of the picture, provided the cover. She married him for access, Eleanor said slowly. Her late husband. She didn't need the man. She needed the estate structure. She needed an account that could receive transfers without anyone looking too closely. That is my reading of it, Thomas Rowe said. Though to prove Caroline's knowledge and participation will require more than financial records. It will require correspondence, Eleanor said, or testimony. Eleanor looked at him. I have one letter, she said. The one I found in the estate files, in her handwriting, referencing the Carter parcels by name. She paused. It uses the words, our agreement. Thomas Rowe was very still. You left it where you found it, he said. I left it exactly where I found it, she said. In the estate files, at Whitmore Manor. He sat back. He rubbed the side of his jaw with 2 fingers. We need that letter, he said. I know, Eleanor said. We cannot go to the manor and retrieve it. If Fenn or Mrs. Beaumont has any suspicion that... I know, she said again. A long pause. Samuel, she said. She did not ask Samuel to take anything. She was precise about that. Extremely precise, because she understood that what she was about to ask him to do was already at the outer edge of what she had any right to request, and she was not going to push past it. She asked him to look. She asked him to confirm whether the letter was still there. In the estate correspondence file, back of the second ledger from the left in the lower cabinet of the study, tucked between the pages rather than folded into the binding. She asked him to tell her only whether it was still there. Nothing else. Samuel listened to all of this with his hat in his hands and his expression completely neutral in the way it went neutral when he was thinking hard and choosing not to show it. Then he said, And if it's still there? Then we will discuss what comes next, Eleanor said. But I need to know first. He nodded. He left the following morning. Howe was back by Thursday evening. He knocked at Clara's kitchen door and came in and sat down and placed his hat on his knee and looked at Eleanor across the table with a steadiness that told her everything before he said a word. It's there, he said. Eleanor exhaled. Exactly where you said, Samuel continued. Back of the second ledger. I looked twice to make sure. He paused. There's something else. She waited. Mr. Fenn is coming back to the manor on Saturday, Samuel said. He sent word ahead. He's bringing papers for Mr. Whitmore to sign. He looked at his hat. I heard the message read out to Mr. Whitmore in the corridor. The papers have to do with a restructuring of the estate's landholding framework. He looked up. The same restructuring they talked about the week after you left. The kitchen was quiet. Once Nathaniel signs those papers, Eleanor said. The Carter parcels get reclassified, Samuel said. Under the new structure, and whatever legal claim comes from your family side of things gets buried, Eleanor said. Samuel nodded. Eleanor looked at Clara, who had been sitting silently at the far end of the table through the whole of this conversation. Clara was looking back at her with an expression Eleanor knew, the expression of a woman who has reached the end of patience with the pace of events and is waiting to hear what happens next. Saturday, Eleanor said. Day after tomorrow, Samuel said. Eleanor sat back in her chair. She thought about the letter in the estate file. She thought about Nathaniel sitting in his study on Saturday afternoon, signing papers his solicitor had prepared, trusting a man he had known for years, believing he was managing his estate responsibly. She thought about her father who had shaken Nathaniel's hand and signed a marriage contract in good faith, believing the Carter land was being protected inside the marriage structure, believing his daughter was going into a stable and honorable arrangement. Her father who had no idea that the land had already been moving when the ink dried. She said, Thomas. Clara reached across the table and touched her niece's arm gently. I'll send for him tonight. Thomas Rowe arrived before 9 o'clock. He was in his coat without a cravat, dressed like a man who had been pulled from his study on short notice and had not seen the point in full formality at that hour. And he came in and sat down and listened while Eleanor laid it out. When she finished, he was quiet for a count of 5. Then, Saturday. Day after tomorrow, Eleanor said. If Whitmore signs those papers, we lose the clearest legal thread we have, she said. The Carter parcels become part of a restructured framework that will take months to untangle, and by then Fen will have had time to clean whatever else is traceable. A pause. I need the letter, and I need it before Saturday. Thomas Rowe looked at her. You are asking me to advise you on the retrieval of a document from an estate you no longer legally reside in. I am asking you, Eleanor said, to tell me whether there is a legal basis for me to enter Whitmore Manor and retrieve correspondence from the estate's business files. A pause. As the wife of the estate's owner, she continued, who reorganized and maintains those filing systems, and whose family's legal interests are directly implicated in the contents of that correspondence. Thomas Rowe looked at her for a long moment. You know, no, he said, that is actually not a frivolous argument. I know, she said. He tapped his fingers on the table once. If you go to the manor, he said slowly, you go in daylight. You go without announcement. You retrieve only the document you have described. You touch nothing else, and you speak to no one except Samuel, who can corroborate your presence and your purpose. He looked at her steadily. And if anyone attempts to prevent you from leaving, they will not, Eleanor said. How can you be certain? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Because, she said, the one thing I know about this situation is that the people orchestrating it need it to remain quiet. A scene, a confrontation, a moment that draws attention. She paused. That is the last thing Aldrich Fenn or Caroline Beaumont wants right now. Thomas Rowe held her gaze. Then he said, Tomorrow morning, early, before the household fully wakes. Yes, Eleanor said. He nodded once. He picked up his hat. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I have one more question. She looked at him. When you retrieve that letter, and I believe you will, what is your plan for what comes after? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She had been thinking about this since Thursday. She had been, if she was honest, thinking about it since the night she walked out of the ballroom. Caroline Beaumont is planning a public gathering, she said. A social occasion. She mentioned it at the reception. I heard her say something to Mrs. Holloway about a summer assembly at Barton Hall in 3 weeks' time. She paused. Every family of significance in Virginia will be there. Thomas Rowe was very still. The same people who were in the Whitmore ballroom, he said. The same people who watched me walk out, she said. The same people who have spent 2 weeks telling each other whatever version of that night serves the story best. You want to bring the truth back to the room. I want to bring it back, Eleanor said, to the people who need to hear it, before the story gets too fixed to change. Thomas Rowe put on his hat. 3 weeks, he said. That's tight. I know, she said. But I've been doing the slow work for 4 months. I can do the fast work in 3 weeks. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he walked to the door. I'll have the documents organized by Monday, he said. Everything we've assembled. Dated, sequenced, and annotated in language that a drawing room full of Virginia landowners can understand without legal training. He paused in the doorway. Get the letter tomorrow, Mrs. Whitmore. I intend to, she said. Joel. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the guest room at Clara's house and stared at the ceiling and went through it. Every step, every possibility, every point at which something could go wrong, with the same methodical attention she had brought to the estate accounts. She thought about walking back into the manor. She thought about what it would feel like to stand in the study again, the room where Nathaniel worked, where Fenn had spent 4 hours behind closed doors the week she left, where the letter was still sitting in a filing cabinet, waiting for someone who understood what it meant. She thought about Nathaniel. She thought about him sitting across a table from his solicitor, trusting him, signing whatever was placed in front of him, believing he was protecting his family's interests. She had married a man who was not cruel. She needed to be clear-eyed about that. He was not a bad man. He was a proud man who had trusted the wrong people and failed to see the right ones. He had looked at her for 11 months and seen a capable, quiet, undemanding wife, and never once asked himself what that quiet was costing her. That was not innocence, but it was not malice either. And in the morning, she was going to walk back into his house, and she was going to take what she came for. And the question she had not yet resolved was what happened when she saw him. Whether she would see him, Whether she could walk through that house and do what needed to be done and come back out without standing in the same room as her husband and trying to decide, in the span of a breath, how much of what she felt was anger, and how much of it was grief, and how much of it was something else entirely that she didn't have a name for yet. She lay still in the dark and breathed. She thought, "You have been waiting to be seen for 11 months. Stop waiting. Go take back what is yours." She closed her eyes. She did not sleep well, but she slept. In the morning, Samuel was waiting for her at the end of Clara's lane. He had 2 horses. He had judged, correctly, that a carriage would be noticed. Eleanor came out of the house in her plainest day dress, her hair simply dressed, no jewelry. Clara stood at the kitchen door and said nothing, which was her way of saying everything. Eleanor mounted. They rode. The morning was warm already, the kind of Virginia summer morning that promises heat by midday and delivers it without apology. The fields on either side of the road were green and loud with birds. Eleanor rode without speaking. She was not afraid, she told herself. She was not afraid. She was merely calculating. They came up to the manor through the back lane, past the kitchen gardens and the stable block, the way servants arrived and departed without drawing attention from the main house. Samuel dismounted first and tied both horses. He looked at Eleanor. "The family is at breakfast," he said quietly. "Mr. Whitmore and his cousin. Mr. Fenn is not arriving until Saturday. The study will be empty." "The study," Eleanor said. "Second door on the left from the main corridor, same as always." She nodded. She straightened her spine. She walked to the back entrance of the house she had managed for 11 months, pressed the latch with a hand that was perfectly steady, and went inside. The house smelled the same. Beeswax and old wood, and the faint, persistent sweetness of the honeysuckle that grew along the south wall. She had noticed that smell the first morning she arrived as a new wife, and she noticed it now, and she did not let it slow her down. She moved through the back corridor, past the kitchen door and the linen cupboard and the narrow staircase that the household staff used, and she turned into the main corridor and walked to the second door on the left, the study. She opened it. She went to the lower cabinet. Second ledger from the left. She lifted it out, opened it, and turned to the back. The letter was there. She picked it up, held it for a moment, and read it once, confirming, quickly, that it was what she remembered. Caroline Beaumont's handwriting, the reference to the Carter parcels, the words "our agreement." She folded it carefully. She placed it inside the front of her dress, against her side. She put the ledger back exactly as it had been. She straightened up, and then the study door opened. Nathaniel Whitmore stood in the doorway. I was in his shirt sleeves. He had come from breakfast, she registered, without his coat. His expression moved through 3 things in rapid succession. Surprise, relief, and something harder to name that sat behind both of them. They looked at each other. The room was very quiet. Then Nathaniel said, "Eleanor." Just her name. Nothing else. Like the word had been waiting in his chest for 12 days, and he had not planned what would come after it. She stood very still. She thought about the letter against her side. She thought about Saturday, and the papers Fenn was bringing, and the 40 acres of Carter land that had been moving through a shell company before she had even married this man. She thought about Thomas Rowe and the documents sitting in his satchel. She thought about Caroline Beaumont's planned assembly at Barton Hall, and the 3 weeks she had to finish what she'd started. She thought about her father's signature on a contract that had already been made false. And then she thought about the man in front of her. Not the husband she had hoped for. The man who was actually there, proud, oblivious, standing in his shirt sleeves in the morning light, looking at her like someone who did not fully understand what he had lost, but was beginning, slowly, to understand that he had lost something. She said, "I came to retrieve some correspondence from the estate files. It's been taken care of." He blinked. "You came for—" He stopped. "Eleanor, you've been gone 12 days. I have sent 2 letters." "I know," she said. "And you haven't replied to either of them." "I know," she said again. He ran a hand over his face. "I don't understand," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not the controlled evenness she had heard from him in the ballroom. Not the tight, managed tone of a man performing reasonable authority. Something rawer than that. Something that sounded like a man who was genuinely lost. I don't understand what has happened. What is happening? I know the night of the reception was... I know what I said was... He stopped. Eleanor waited. He said, very quietly, I should not have asked you to apologize. The room was still. Eleanor looked at him. No, she said. You should not have. He nodded. He was looking at the floor now, one hand braced on the doorframe. Will you come home? He said. The question landed in the room like something heavy. Eleanor stood with Caroline's letter against her side, and 4 months of financial evidence locked in her memory, and 3 weeks of work ahead of her, and looked at the man she had married. Not yet, she said. He looked up. There are things that need to be resolved, she said. Things that have nothing to do with the night of the reception. Things that concern the estate. Things you need to know about. She held his gaze. When the time is right, I will tell you everything. And I need you to trust that when I say it's not time yet, I am not being difficult. I am protecting what is left of your family's name. He stared at her. What are you talking about? He said. Not today, she said. He took a step forward. Eleanor, Nathaniel. Her voice was steady and quiet, and carried the weight of 11 months of patience and 12 days of purpose. Do you trust me? He stopped. He looked at her, truly looked at her, maybe for the first time in longer than either of them wanted to acknowledge. Then he said, yes. One word. Quiet. Like he meant it. Then trust me now, she said. And do not sign anything Aldrich Fenn brings you on Saturday until you have spoken with me first. He went very still. What? Promise me, she said. A long moment. I promise, he said. She nodded once. She walked past him, through the doorway, back into the corridor. She moved through the back of the house the way she had come, out through the kitchen entrance, across the yard to where Samuel was waiting with the horses. She mounted. She did not look back at the house. She had the letter. She had Nathaniel's promise. She had 3 weeks. She rode back toward Clara's house in the Virginia summer morning, with the letter warm against her side, and the full weight of what was coming settling into her bones. Not as a burden, but as a purpose. She was not done. She was barely started. 3 weeks. That was what Eleanor had given herself, standing in the corridor of Whitmore Manor with Caroline Beaumont's letter pressed against her ribs, and her husband's promise still warm in the air between them. 3 weeks to finish what 4 months of quiet, invisible work had started. She rode back to Clara's house and went straight to the writing desk and did not stop working until the candles burned low. Thomas Rowe came the next morning. She put the letter in front of him before he had fully sat down. He read it once, then again. Then he set it flat on the table and pressed 2 fingers against the paper as though he needed to confirm it was real. Caroline Beaumont's handwriting, Eleanor said. The same hand that sent a social correspondence to the manor the week after my arrival. I have that letter as well. It was in the household files. The hand is identical. The Carter parcels, Thomas Rowe said, reading the line aloud. Our agreement regarding the Carter parcels. He looked up. She knew about the land transfer before the marriage. She was part of it before the marriage, Eleanor said. He sat back. This is the piece we were missing, he said. The financial records establish the movement of money and property. But this, he tapped the letter, establishes intent, establishes communication between the parties, establishes that Caroline Beaumont was not a passive beneficiary of Fenn's scheme. She was a participant. Can we use it? Eleanor asked. In a legal proceeding, yes. The letter is documentary evidence retrieved from the estate's own files, files you organized and maintained. The provenance is defensible. He paused. In the public forum you're contemplating, the assembly at Barton Hall, it becomes something different. It becomes a statement. That's what I want it to be, Eleanor said. Thomas Rowe looked at her carefully. You understand that when you present this publicly, you cannot take it back. Whatever happens in that room, whatever responses it triggers, you are committed. I have been committed, Eleanor said, since the night I left. He nodded slowly. Then we have 3 weeks, he said. Let's use them properly. Saturday came and went. Aldrich Fenn arrived at Whitmore Manor as planned, traveling case in hand, papers prepared. He spent 4 hours at the manor. He had a long meeting with Nathaniel in the study. He presented the restructuring documents. Nathaniel did not sign them. Samuel sent word to Clara's house by late afternoon. A brief note, 4 lines, delivered by a stable boy who asked no questions and waited for no reply. He held. Fenn left without signatures. Mr. W. looked troubled all evening. No word of why. Eleanor read the note at the kitchen table. Clara watched her from across the room. He kept his promise, Eleanor said. You sound surprised, Clara said. I'm not surprised, Eleanor said. She stopped. She folded the note carefully. I'm relieved. That's different. She put the note in the notebook. She went back to work. What she was building, in those 3 weeks, was not simply a case. It was a presentation, carefully sequenced, emotionally precise, designed for an audience of Virginia landowners and their wives who had grown up understanding that reputation was the only currency that never lost its value. She and Thomas Rowe worked through it methodically, evening after evening at Clara's kitchen table, the documents spread between them, a candle at each end. The financial records came first. The easiest to understand, the hardest to dispute. 3 years of transactions. 30 individual transfers. The shell company that received the property and existed only on paper. The account in the Beaumont estate's name, authorized after the husband's death by the executor who also managed the Whitmore accounts. Then the deed transfer. The 40 Carter acres, moved 3 months before the wedding, before Eleanor's father had signed anything, before any of the Carter family had any idea their land was already in motion. Then the letter. Saved for last. 1 page, 1 handwriting, 1 line that said our agreement and made the whole shape of it undeniable. Thomas Rowe had a colleague in Richmond who confirmed the shell company's non-existence in the business registry. He had a second contact at the county deeds office who provided certified copies of the relevant filings. He had, through careful inquiry, located 2 other families in the county whose estate accounts had passed through Fenn's management and showed similar small irregularities. Nothing as large as the Whitmore situation, but enough to establish a pattern. We need one more thing, Thomas Rowe said, on the second Thursday of the 3 weeks. Eleanor looked up from the document she was reviewing. We need Nathaniel, he said. She was quiet. Not necessarily his presence at Barton Hall, Thomas Rowe said carefully, but his knowledge, his understanding of what has happened under his own name. He paused. If he walks into that assembly still unaware of the full situation and the truth comes out in front of everyone, it will destroy him publicly. He will have no chance to respond, to clarify, to demonstrate that he was a victim of this scheme rather than a participant. And if he's humiliated publicly, the story becomes about him, Thomas Rowe said, about his failure, about his blindness. The people in that room will spend the next 6 months talking about Nathaniel Whitmore's negligence. And Caroline Beaumont and Aldrich Fenn will recede into the background while the county focuses on the easier target. Eleanor understood. She had understood before he finished the sentence. I have to tell him, she said. Before the assembly, Thomas Rowe said. Yes. She set down the document she was holding. She looked at the kitchen wall. She had been managing this for 4 months on her own, and for 3 weeks with Thomas Rowe. And the thought of sitting across from Nathaniel and walking him through the full scope of what had been done under his name and with his trust, the thought of watching his face move through the understanding of it, was the hardest thing she had contemplated yet. Not because she was afraid of him, because she knew exactly what it would cost him. And some part of her, some stubborn, inconvenient, entirely human part of her, still did not want to be the person who paid that kind of blow. I know, she said. When? Thomas Rowe asked. She thought. 1 week before the assembly, she said. That gives him enough time to understand, and not so much time that he can attempt to intervene before we're ready." Thomas Rowe nodded. He picked up his pen. "Then we need everything ready before that conversation," he said. "So you walk in with the full picture. Nothing incomplete. Nothing that requires him to take your word for it." "Agreed," she said. She picked up her own pen. They went back to work. What she had not anticipated was Caroline Beaumont. Not the assembly. She had planned for that. Not the legal exposure. She and Thomas Rowe had mapped every angle. What she had not anticipated was Caroline coming to Clara's house. She arrived on a Wednesday morning, 11 days before the Barton Hall assembly, in a carriage that Eleanor did not recognize until it had already stopped at the end of Clara's lane. Clara saw it from this kitchen window and said quietly, "You have a visitor." Eleanor came to look. She recognized Caroline immediately. The gold dress replaced today with something in pale green, but the posture the same, the studied elegance the same, the way she moved as she descended from the carriage like a woman who had rehearsed being watched. Eleanor did not move from the kitchen doorway. "She's coming to the house," Clara said. "I can see that." "Do you want me to send her away?" Eleanor thought about this for exactly 3 seconds. "No," she said. "Let her in." Clara went to the door. Eleanor remained in the kitchen. She stood with her hands still at her sides and her breathing steady, and she thought, she knows something, or she suspects something. Either way, she has come here, which means something has changed. Something had made Caroline Beaumont nervous enough to come in person. And that was the most useful piece of information Eleanor had received in 3 weeks. Clara showed Caroline into the small sitting room. Eleanor took a moment. She allowed herself that moment, precisely that and no more, to arrange herself. She smoothed her dress. She lifted her chin. She walked into the sitting room as though it were her own and sat down across from the most dangerous woman in Virginia with the expression of someone who was mildly interested in what the morning had delivered. "Mrs. Beaumont," she said, "this is unexpected." Caroline sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her expression perfectly composed in the way of a woman who had spent years making certain that her expressions told people only what she wanted them to know. "I heard you were staying with your aunt," Caroline said. "You heard correctly. I wanted to call and—" A slight pause. "Express my regret about the circumstances." Eleanor looked at her. "Which circumstances?" she asked pleasantly. A flicker. Small, controlled, but there. "The evening of the Whitmore reception," Caroline said. "I'm aware that the situation became uncomfortable. I want you to know that was never my intention." "Was it not?" Eleanor said. Not a question. Another flicker. "I was genuinely distressed by what I perceived as an insult," Caroline said. "I may have reacted more publicly than was wise." "You accused me of something I didn't say," Eleanor said. "In front of 300 people. My husband asked me to apologize." She paused. "That is a fairly precise description of what happened." Caroline's composure held, but only just. "I think," she said carefully, "that there may have been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Eleanor said. "I would like to mend things between us, if that's possible." Caroline met her eyes directly. "I think it would be beneficial, for both of us, given that your husband and I have ongoing business matters to address." And there it was. Eleanor let the silence sit for exactly long enough to make Caroline feel it. Then she said, "What kind of business matters?" "The estate restructuring," Caroline said. "There are some land management questions that Mr. Whitmore and I are working through with Mr. Fenn." "I'm not sure I'm aware of those details," Eleanor said. "I thought perhaps you might be," Caroline said, "given your involvement in the estate's organizational systems." The sitting room was very quiet. Eleanor held Caroline's gaze and did not look away. She understood now precisely why Caroline had come. Fenn had told her that Nathaniel had not signed the papers on Saturday. Fenn had told her something had changed. And Caroline, intelligent, careful, always thinking 3 moves ahead, had come here to find out whether Eleanor was the reason for the change, whether Eleanor knew anything, whether Eleanor was a problem that needed managing before the assembly at Barton Hall. And the remarkable thing, the thing that Eleanor felt settle into her like a quiet certainty, was that Caroline had come here expecting to find a frightened woman. A woman who had fled her husband's house, who was living on the charity of an elderly aunt, who had been publicly humiliated and was still licking the wound. She had not expected to find what was actually sitting across from her. "Mrs. Beaumont," Eleanor said, "I appreciate you calling, I do, and I appreciate your regret about the circumstances of the reception." She folded her hands in her lap, mirroring Caroline's posture back at her with a precision that was entirely deliberate. "I want to assure you that I have no intention of allowing personal difficulties to interfere with my husband's business affairs." A pause. "Whatever he and Mr. Fenn are working through, I'm certain they'll reach a satisfactory arrangement." Caroline looked at her, reading her, trying to decide whether she was being told the truth. "I'm glad to hear that," she said finally. "Was there anything else?" Eleanor asked. A beat. "No," Caroline said. "I think that covers it." She stood. Eleanor stood. They exchanged the courtesies of well-bred Virginia women. Brief, precise, perfectly calibrated. And Eleanor walked Caroline to Clara's front door and watched her carriage roll back down the lane. Then she turned around. Clara was standing in the kitchen doorway. "Well?" Clara said. "She's frightened," Eleanor said. "I could see that from here. Not frightened enough to stop, but frightened enough to come and check whether I'm a threat." Eleanor moved back toward the kitchen. "Which means someone told her that Nathaniel didn't sign on Saturday, and she's been wondering why." "Does she know what you have?" "No," Eleanor said. "Not yet." She sat down at the table. "But she suspects something, which means I have less time than I thought." She looked at her aunt. "I need to see Nathaniel. Not in a week. Now." She sent word to the manor that same afternoon. Not through Samuel this time. She wrote a note in her own hand, sealed it herself, and sent it with Clara's household boy. "I need to speak with you. Not at the manor. Clara's house, if you're willing. Tomorrow morning, if you can manage it. There are things you need to hear, and I need to be the one to tell you. E." His reply came before dark. "I will be there at 9. She did not sleep that night either. She sat at the writing desk and went through the documents one more time, not because she didn't know them, but because she needed to feel the weight of them in her hands. Needed to remind herself that what she was about to do was right and necessary and had been in motion long before this night. She thought about Nathaniel. She thought about the look on his face when he had found her in the study, the raw, unguarded thing in it before he had time to arrange himself. She thought about, "I should not have asked you to apologize," which was the closest he had come to an apology without reaching all the way to one. She thought about what she was going to tell him in the morning. The shell company, the forged land transfers, the 40 Carter acres that had been moving before she'd even worn his name. The 3 years of small diversions that had been quietly draining his estate while he trusted the man doing the draining. The woman who had orchestrated all of it from just far enough outside the frame to stay clean. She thought about the moment his face would change when he understood. She pressed her hands flat on the desk. She thought, "This is not a punishment. This is not revenge. This is the truth, and he deserves it. And so does your father. And so do you." She went to bed. She stared at the ceiling. She slept finally, just before dawn. Nathaniel arrived at Clara's house at 9 o'clock precisely. He came alone, which she had half expected. He was in his riding coat, his hat in his hand, and he knocked at the front door like a guest, rather than a man who had any claim on the house or the woman inside it. Clara opened the door, said good morning, Mr. Whitmore with the neutral courtesy of a woman who had already rendered her verdict on a person, and saw no need to announce it, and showed him to the sitting room. Eleanor was already there. She had arranged the documents on the table, not in a pile, in a sequence. The way Thomas Rowe had helped her order them. The way that told the story most clearly, from the earliest evidence to the most recent. Nathaniel came in and stopped when he saw the table. He looked at the documents, then at Eleanor. "Sit down, Nathaniel," she said. He sat. He put his hat on his knee. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the controlled public face, not the tight-jawed authority of the reception evening, but something careful and open and braced. The expression of a man who has walked into a room knowing he is about to be told something important and has decided, beforehand, to listen. She picked up the first document. She began. It took 40 minutes. She walked him through it piece by piece, the way she and Thomas Rowe had practiced. Not emotionally, not with accusation, but with the precision of a woman presenting facts that could stand without embellishment. The transaction records. The shell company. The deed transfer dated 3 months before their wedding. The Beaumont estate account. The authorization signatures. The letter. Nathaniel sat through all of it without speaking. She had expected interruptions, had prepared for them, had anticipated the moments when he would push back, demand clarification, assert that Fenn was trustworthy, that Caroline was a respectable woman, that the figures must have another explanation. He didn't interrupt once. He sat with his hands on his knees and his hat forgotten on the floor beside his chair, and he watched her lay it out, document by document, and his face moved through things she did not have names for. When she finished, she set the last document down. The room was silent. Nathaniel looked at the table. He looked at the documents spread across it. The 3 years of Fenn's careful theft. The 40 acres of Carter land already in motion before Eleanor had ever signed her name into his family's history. Caroline's letter with its one damning line. Then he said very quietly, "My father trusted Fenn." "I know," Eleanor said. "He trusted him for 20 years, before I ever—" He stopped. He put his hand over his mouth for a moment, which was the most unguarded gesture she had ever seen from him. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked up. "I don't believe you knew," she said. "I want you to hear me say that directly. I don't believe you were part of this. I believe you trusted the wrong man because your father trusted him before you, and no one told you to look more carefully." He held her gaze. Something in him was very close to breaking. She could see it. Not into anger, but into something more complicated and less manageable than anger. The particular pain of a proud man, understanding that his pride had made him blind. "The Carter land," he said. "My family's parcels," she said. "Yes." "Your father signed the marriage contract." "Believing the land was inside the estate's legal structure," she said. "It was already gone." He closed his eyes. He sat like that for a count of 5. Then he opened them. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to Barton Hall," she said. "The assembly, in 11 days. I'm going to present this, everything on this table, and more, to the people who were in your ballroom on the night of the reception." He stared at her. "Eleanor, the same people who watched you ask me to apologize," she said. "The same people who watched me walk out." She held his gaze steadily. "They will hear the truth. They will understand what has been done under your name and with your estate. And when it's over, Aldrich Fenn will not hold a solicitor's license in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Caroline Beaumont will never again walk into a room of her peers without every one of them knowing exactly what she is." Nathaniel was very still. "You could have done this quietly," he said, "through legal channels. Thomas Rowe could pursue it through the courts, yes," she said, "which would take 2 to 3 years, during which Fenn will have destroyed or hidden every record he can reach, and Caroline will have managed the social narrative so thoroughly that no one will remember the truth when the verdict finally comes." She paused. "The people in that room at Barton Hall are the people whose opinion shapes this county. Their fathers and their husbands and their brothers make the decisions about who gets business and who gets partnerships and whose name carries weight." She paused again. "I am not going to let Caroline Beaumont control the story for 3 years while the lawyers argue. I am going to take the story back." Nathaniel looked at her. For a long time he said nothing. She let him think. She had given him what he needed. She had told him the truth. She had sat across from him in her aunt's sitting room and treated him like a man who deserved to know and trusted him with the things she had been building in secret for 4 months. Now it was his turn. "What do you need from me?" he said. She had prepared for many responses. She had not fully prepared for that one. She looked at him. "I need you to come to Barton Hall," she said. "Not to manage the situation, not to defend yourself or the estate or your name in advance. Just to be there, to hear it alongside everyone else, so that when it comes out, and it will all come out, no one in that room can say you were hiding." He nodded. "And the Saturday papers," she said. "I won't sign them," he said. "Not until you tell me it's time." He paused. "I gave you my word." "I know," she said. He picked his hat up from the floor. He turned it in his hands for a moment. Then, "Eleanor." He said her name differently than he had in the study, not like a thing that had been stored and released, but like a word he was choosing carefully. "I owe you." He stopped. He started again. "I have owed you an accounting for a long time, for more than what happened at the reception." A beat. "I understand that an apology today is not equal to what the situation requires. I understand that words from me right now are insufficient." He met her eyes. "But I want you to know," he said, "that I hear you. I see what you've done, what you've been doing." He shook his head slowly. "While I was managing the surface of things, you were managing the truth of them." He stopped. "I didn't deserve that from you." The sitting room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at the man across from her. She thought about what to say. She said, "No, you didn't." Simple, honest. He nodded. He accepted it. "But," she said, "what happens next is more important than what happened before." She held his gaze. 11 days, Barton Hall, be there." "I will be there," he said. He stood. He walked to the door of the sitting room and stopped. He turned back. "The woman I married," he said, and his voice was different again, quieter and more deliberate. "Spent 11 months managing my house, my accounts, and apparently my legal exposure, while I looked straight through her." A pause. "I have been thinking about that since the night you left." Eleanor said nothing. "I intend to stop," he said. "Looking through you." He put his hat on. He left. Clara appeared in the doorway 30 seconds after the front door closed. Eleanor was still sitting exactly where she had been. "How did it go?" Clara asked. Eleanor looked at the documents spread across the table. "Better than I expected," she said. "Did he understand?" "Yes," she said. "I think he finally did." Clara came in and sat down across from her niece. She looked at Eleanor's face with the careful attention of someone who had known her since childhood and could read every register of her expression. "How do you feel?" Clara asked. Eleanor thought about this honestly for a moment. "Like someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time," she said. "And who can see the place where she's going to be able to set it down?" She paused. "But hasn't gotten there yet." Clara nodded. 11 days, Clara said. 11 days, Eleanor agreed. She began gathering the documents back into their sequence. Her hands were steady. The next 11 days were the most precisely executed of Eleanor's life. Thomas Rowe finalized the document package, certified copies of everything, organized in the order Eleanor had determined, with a written summary prepared in plain language for the benefit of anyone in the room who found figures difficult to follow. He had the shell company's non-existence confirmed in writing by the Richmond Business Registry. He had a sworn statement from Samuel Grant, witnessed and signed, attesting to what he had heard in the Whitmore study and what he had observed of the estate's financial management over 30 years of service. He also had something Eleanor had not asked for, but found, on the morning he delivered everything to Clara's kitchen, to be the most significant thing on the table. "I found a third family," Thomas Rowe said. Eleanor looked up. "Another estate whose accounts passed through Fenn's management," he said. "The Hargrove family, Northern County. They lost a parcel of riverland 6 years ago that they believed was a straightforward sale. The buyer was—" "The same shell company," Eleanor said. "A different name," he said. "But the same structure, same account routing, same pattern." He set the document down. The Hargrove family still does not know what happened to that land. Eleanor sat very still. They will be at Barton Hall, she said. It was not a question. The Hargroves are one of the oldest families in the county, Thomas Rowe said. They will be there. Eleanor looked at the document. She thought about the full room at Barton Hall, the assembled weight of Virginia society, the people who set the terms of reputation and consequence in this county. She thought about what it meant that there was a second family, that this was not simply the Whitmore estate, not simply her family's land, not simply Eleanor's marriage. This was a pattern. This was years. This was a man who had positioned himself at the center of old Virginia money and quietly bled it while everyone looked the other way. Thomas, she said. He looked at her. We need to reach the Hargroves before Barton Hall, she said. Not to reveal everything, not yet, but to let them know that something will be coming to light, so that when they hear it, they are prepared rather than blindsided. He was quiet for a moment. That is a significant escalation, he said carefully. I know, she said. Do you have a contact with the family? A pause. I may, he said. Then use it, she said. He nodded. He picked up his pen. 2 days before the assembly, Caroline Beaumont called on the manor. Samuel sent word to Clara's house within the hour. The note was brief. CB at the manor. 3 hours. Left before dinner. Mr. W. did not look well after. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table. She handed it to Clara. Clara read it. She's been to see him, Clara said. She's trying to shore up whatever ground she's losing, Eleanor said. She knows something has shifted. She doesn't know exactly what. But she came to the manor, which means she's still trying to manage the situation through Nathaniel. Eleanor set the note down. She believes if she can keep him comfortable and compliant, everything else holds. Does she know you've spoken with him? Clara asked. I don't think so, Eleanor said. But she suspects something. She paused. Which means the next 48 hours are the most dangerous. If she discovers what's coming before the assembly, she'll destroy what she can, Clara said. Or disappear, Eleanor said. And if she disappears before Barton Hall, we lose the public accounting. We lose the moment. She looked at her aunt. I need Fen and Caroline both in that room. How do you ensure that? Clara asked. Eleanor thought. Then she picked up her pen. She wrote 2 notes. The first was to Aldrich Fen, formal, carefully worded, in the voice of a wife returning to practical considerations. It made reference to the estate restructuring documents. It said she had some questions she would like addressed regarding the Carter land holdings, and that she understood he would be attending the Barton Hall assembly as a guest of Mrs. Beaumont. It suggested they might find a moment to speak, an invitation that would read, to Fen, as an uninformed woman with mild concerns, the kind of woman who could be reassured in 5 minutes and sent away. The second note was to Caroline, shorter. It said only, I think we got off to a poor start. I will be at Barton Hall, and I hope we might speak. She sealed both notes. She handed them to Clara's household boy. Then she went back to the writing desk and spent the rest of the evening making certain that every document, every record, every piece of evidence she and Thomas Rowe had assembled was in perfect order. Because in 2 days, she was going to walk into the room where Virginia society gathered, and she was going to say everything, and nothing, not Fen's wariness, not Caroline's intelligence, not the 48 hours between now and then, was going to stop her. She was done being the woman nobody saw. In 2 days, she intended to make absolutely certain that everyone in that room understood exactly who she was, what she knew, and what she had been doing while they were all looking somewhere else. She pressed her pen to the paper. She checked the figures one final time. She was ready. The morning of the Barton Hall assembly, Eleanor woke before dawn. She lay still for a moment, the way she had learned to do in these past weeks, taking inventory before she moved, making certain she was ready before the day could start without her consent. Everything was in order. The documents were in Thomas Rowe's satchel, which he would carry. The certified copies were in a second case, held by a young associate he trusted. Samuel had confirmed he would attend as a witness, dressed in his Sunday coat, prepared to speak if called upon. Thomas had sent word to the Hargroves 3 days prior, a carefully managed note that had prompted a response of 4 lines that said, essentially, "We will be listening." Fenn had replied to her note. He had confirmed he would be attending the assembly as Mrs. Beaumont's guest. Caroline had replied as well. Her note said, "I look forward to speaking with you, Mrs. Whitmore. I believe we understand each other better than circumstances have allowed us to show." Eleanor had read that line twice and understood it for exactly what it was. The response of a woman who believed she had assessed her opponent and found her manageable. The graciousness of someone who was certain she controlled the room. She folded the note and put it with the others. Then she got dressed. Clara came to the doorway of the guest room while Eleanor was pinning her hair. She stood there for a moment without speaking, watching her niece in the mirror with the expression Eleanor had come to think of as her aunt's truest face, stripped of the dry wit and the practical commentary. Just a woman looking at someone she loved with the full, uncomplicated weight of it. "You look like your mother," Clara said. Eleanor met her eyes in the mirror. "She would have handled this better than I have," Eleanor said. "She would have cried more," Clara said, and felt guilty longer. She came into the room and straightened the back of Eleanor's collar with the automatic care of a woman who had been tidying other people's appearances for 70 years. "You got the better part of her, the spine without the guilt." Eleanor almost smiled. "I have plenty of guilt," she said. "About what?" "About Nathaniel." She lowered her hands from her hair. "About what this is going to do to him publicly. Whatever he's done, whatever he's failed to do, having the truth of his estate's condition laid out in front of 300 people is going to be the consequence of trusting the wrong people," Clara said, not unkindly. "That is not your guilt to carry." "I know," Eleanor said, "but you're carrying it anyway." "Yes." Clara put her hands on Eleanor's shoulders from behind and looked at her niece's face in the mirror. "Eleanor," she said, "you have spent 11 months carrying things that weren't yours. Your husband's comfort, his social obligations, his estate accounts, his reputation." She held her gaze. "Today, you carry the truth. That one is yours. That one you earned." A pause. "Put everything else down." Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was not the woman who had arrived at Whitmore Manor 11 months ago. Quiet and accommodating, and braced always for the possibility that she was asking too much simply by existing. That woman had been patient in this way that fear disguises itself as virtue. This woman had 12 pages of organized financial analysis, and a letter in Caroline Beaumont's handwriting, and a lawyer in the next county, and a promise from her husband, and 30 years of Samuel Grant's loyalty. She picked up her gloves. "I'm ready," she said. Thomas Rowe met her outside Barton Hall. He was there before anyone else arrived, standing at the side entrance with his associate and his satchel, and he looked at Eleanor when she descended from Clara's carriage with the expression of a man taking a final measure of something before committing his full weight to it. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. "The Hargroves are coming," he said. "I had confirmation this morning. They'll be there." He paused. "I also heard from my Richmond contact late last night. I was going to send word, but the hour was too late." Eleanor looked at him. "What contact?" "The one I used to verify the shell company," he said. "He did some additional pulling at my request, quietly." He opened his satchel and removed a single folded document. "This arrived by courier yesterday evening." She took it. She unfolded it. It was a record of account, not from Virginia, but from a bank in Philadelphia. The account holder was listed under a name she didn't immediately recognize, but the receiving transactions, dated over a 3-year period, were in amounts that matched precisely the outgoing transfers she had mapped from the Whitmore estate accounts. She looked up. "Fenn has a Philadelphia account," she said. "In his wife's maiden name," Thomas Rowe said. "The money doesn't stay in the Beaumont estate account. It moves again. Through the shell company, through the estate account, and then north." He paused. "He's been building a fund outside Virginia for years. Enough, with what's accumulated, to leave the state entirely if he chose to. Eleanor was very still. He was planning to disappear, she said, at some point, when the amounts were sufficient. Thomas Rowe took the document back carefully. I think the wedding, your marriage to Mr. Whitmore, accelerated the timeline. The Carter parcels were a larger prize than anything he'd moved before. I think he got ambitious. And Caroline? Eleanor said. I believe she knew, he said. I believe the arrangement was that she provided the social cover and the estate vehicle, and Fenn managed the technical execution, and at some point they intended to split the proceeds and part ways. He paused. Whether she knew about the Philadelphia account, whether she knew he was planning to leave her holding everything if it collapsed, I cannot say. Eleanor looked at the entrance of Barton Hall. People were beginning to arrive. Carriages on the drive. Voices. The specific sound of Virginia society assembling for an occasion. He might run, she said. If he suspects anything, Thomas Rowe said. Yes, which is why the timing today must be precise. We cannot give him a moment to assess the situation and make a decision. The presentation must move quickly. I know, Eleanor said. She put on her gloves. How long do I have once we're inside before the assembly formally begins? Perhaps 40 minutes of social time, he said. Then the Bartons will call the room to order for the formal part of the evening. Then I need 20 of those 40 minutes, she said. Informally, moving through the room, letting people see me, speak to me, form their impressions before anything begins. She looked at Thomas Rowe. I need them to see me as Eleanor Whitmore before they hear Eleanor Whitmore. Do you understand the difference? He looked at her for a moment. I do, he said. Give me 20 minutes, she said. Then we begin. She walked into Barton Hall. The first person she saw inside was Mrs. Holloway. Margaret Holloway, who had been standing beside Eleanor in the Whitmore ballroom on the night of the reception, who had touched her arm in that half-comfort, half-warning gesture, who had watched everything and said nothing, and whose husband did significant business with the Whitmore estate. Mrs. Holloway saw Eleanor at the same moment and went visibly still for a half-second, the brief arrest of a woman processing something unexpected. And then her expression resolved into something that Eleanor read as relief. She crossed toward Eleanor directly. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, I am glad to see you. Mrs. Holloway, Eleanor said, it's good to be here. A beat in which both women understood perfectly that they were not talking about Barton Hall. You look well, Mrs. Holloway said. I am well, Eleanor said. Better than when we last spoke. Mrs. Holloway glanced once around the room, the quick, practiced assessment of a woman who has navigated social gatherings as a form of warfare for 30 years. And then back at Eleanor. I want you to know, she said, lower now, that I have thought about that evening a great deal. What was said? What was allowed to happen? She pressed her lips together briefly. I should have said something at the time. There wasn't much to say at the time, Eleanor said. The situation didn't yet have enough truth in it to be worth arguing about. Mrs. Holloway looked at her. Does it now? She said. It does, Eleanor said. I hope you'll stay close this evening. Something in Mrs. Holloway's expression shifted. The look of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this kind of invitation without knowing she was waiting for it. I intend to, she said. Eleanor moved through the room. She spoke to 7 families in 20 minutes. Not about anything of substance, not yet. Just the normal social currency of these gatherings. Greetings, compliments, careful questions about children and properties and the summer's heat. She said Nathaniel's name where it was natural, in the way of a wife who is present and connected to her husband rather than estranged from him. She needed these people to remember, in about 20 minutes' time, that she had spoken to them like a normal woman at a normal gathering. She needed the contrast to matter. She found the Hargroves near the east windows, a tall couple in their 50s, the husband with a careful, watchful quality that told Eleanor he had received Thomas Rowe's message and had been thinking about it ever since. She introduced herself simply. Mr. Hargrove, Mrs. Hargrove, I'm Eleanor Whitmore. Something moved in his eyes. He shook her hand with a grip that said more than the greeting. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I received a communication recently that I've been thinking about considerably." "I imagine you have," she said. "I hope you'll bear with me this evening. Things will become clearer." "How much clearer?" he said quietly. "All the way," she said. He nodded, once, slowly. "We'll be here," he said. She found Caroline at the center of the room, which was where Caroline always positioned herself, close enough to the dominant conversational cluster to shape it, far enough from any particular person to maintain independence. Caroline saw her coming. To her credit, her expression didn't change. She held Eleanor's gaze with the composed ease of someone who has been performing confidence for so long that it has become indistinguishable from the real thing. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "you came." "I said I would," Eleanor said. "You did." Caroline's eyes moved over her briefly, a quick, comprehensive read. "You look different than when I called on you." "I feel different," Eleanor said. "The time away from the manor has done you good, perhaps." "It has," Eleanor agreed. "It gave me a great deal of time to think." "About what?" Caroline asked. She asked it lightly, the question of a woman making conversation rather than extracting information. But Eleanor had spent 4 months learning to read the difference between those two things, and she heard the edge beneath it. "About the estate," Eleanor said pleasantly. "About the records. About what the past 3 years actually look like when you map the accounts in full." She paused. "It's remarkable what becomes visible when you have the time to look carefully." A very small stillness. There and gone in less than a second. "I'm sure Nathaniel appreciates your attention to his household concerns," Caroline said. "I hope so," Eleanor said. "I also hope that he and Mr. Finn will have a chance to discuss some of those concerns this evening. I've sent word ahead." She smiled. "I imagine you'll find it an interesting conversation." She moved on before Caroline could respond. She found Finn near the doorway. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the careful way of someone who has money but did not grow up with it and has spent years ensuring no one could tell the difference. He had the practiced ease of a man who understood that in rooms like this one, the solicitors and advisors stood slightly to the side and let the families occupy the center, and who had leveraged that invisibility expertly for 3 decades. He saw Eleanor approaching, and his expression did something she had not expected. He smiled. Not cautiously, not warily, with the full confidence of a man who had already assessed Eleanor Whitmore and found her unalarming. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "a pleasure. I believe you wish to speak with me about some questions regarding the estate structure." "I do," she said, "though I think the answers may take a little longer than either of us anticipated." Something shifted in his smile. Barely, but she caught it. "I'm happy to set aside some time," he said. "Though the restructuring documents are quite straightforward, I assure you. Mr. Whitmore will find them entirely in order once he has the opportunity to review." "Mr. Whitmore is here," Eleanor said. Fenn's eyes moved to the entrance. Nathaniel had just come through the door. He was in his best coat, hat in hand, and he looked, Eleanor registered this immediately, like a man who had spent the past 11 days doing something more difficult than managing an estate. He looked like a man who had been thinking, really thinking, the kind that costs something. He saw Eleanor. He crossed toward her directly. He did not look at Fenn. He looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and said it like a choice rather than a greeting. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "I'm glad you're here." "I gave my word," he said simply. Fenn was watching this exchange with the careful attention of a man recalibrating. Then a voice cut through the general noise of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if we might bring the evening's gathering to order." The host of Barton Hall, standing at the far end of the room, gesturing toward the assembled company. Thomas Rowe appeared at Eleanor's side. The satchel was open. "It's time," he said quietly. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. "Stay close," she said. He nodded. She turned toward the front of the room. What happened in the next 40 minutes would be talked about in Virginia for the better part of a decade. Not because it was theatrical, not because there was shouting or weeping or any of the dramatics that these stories accumulate in the retelling. It happened quietly, which was somehow worse or better, depending on where you stood. Eleanor waited until the host's opening remarks concluded, and the room began to settle into the informal second half of the evening's program. She waited until the natural social movement of the gathering had distributed people into their conversational clusters. She waited until Fenn had moved toward the sideboard, and Caroline had drifted to the window cluster, and the Hargroves had positioned themselves near the center of the room. Then she asked the host, briefly, politely, if she might have 5 minutes to address the gathering on a matter of some importance to several families present. The host, who knew the Whitmore name and knew Thomas Rowe's reputation, and had observed the evening's undercurrents with the quiet attention of a man who hosted these gatherings precisely because he liked to know what was happening in his county, agreed. The room came to attention. Eleanor stood at the front of it. She had stood in front of this room before, not this room, but rooms like it, managing conversations and directing social traffic with the background skill of a woman who had learned early that being useful was the price of being present. She had stood in rooms like this and been invisible. She was not invisible now. 300 people looked at her. She said, "Thank you for your time. I want to speak about something that concerns several of the families here tonight. And I want to be as clear and as brief as I can, because what I have to say is not complicated. The facts speak well enough on their own." She nodded to Thomas Rowe. He placed the first document on the table that had been set up quietly during the host's remarks. "Over the past 3 years," Eleanor said, "the Whitmore estate has been subject to a systematic diversion of funds and property. 30 individual financial transfers. A shell company that does not legally exist. A deed transfer of 40 acres of Carter family land, my family's land, that was executed 3 months before my marriage, and therefore before the land was legitimately included in any estate agreement." The room was very quiet. "The account through which these funds moved is held in the name of the Beaumont estate," she continued, "and was authorized, after the death of the estate's owner, by its executor, who is also the Whitmore family solicitor." She paused. "That solicitor is Mr. Aldrich Fenn, who is in this room." Heads turned. Fenn, by the sideboard, had gone very still. "I also want to note," Eleanor said, "that this is not limited to the Whitmore estate." She looked toward the Hargroves. The Hargrove family lost a parcel of riverland 6 years ago in a transaction that followed an identical structure. The same shell company, the same account routing, the same executor authorization. She looked at Mr. Hargrove directly. "I believe you have been wondering about that land for 6 years, sir. Tonight you have an answer." The room moved. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But in the way of a large body of water when something heavy has been dropped into it. A shift from one state to another. Irreversible. She heard Caroline's voice from the window cluster, sharp and controlled. "This is a serious accusation." "It is," Eleanor said. She did not raise her voice. "That is why I have brought documentation." Thomas Rowe placed the second set of documents on the table. "Certified copies of every transaction record," Eleanor said. "Certified confirmation of the shell company's non-existence in the Virginia Business Registry. The deed transfer, filed and registered, moving Carter land 3 months before the marriage contract it was supposed to support." She paused. "And a letter." She placed Caroline's letter on the table herself. "Written by Mrs. Caroline Beaumont," she said, "referencing the Carter parcel arrangement, using the phrase, 'our agreement.'" She looked up. "The original remains in the Whitmore estate files, where I found it, and where it has remained untouched." The silence in the room was absolute. Then Fenn moved. He moved for the door. Not running, not yet, but the movement of a man making a rapid and well-practiced calculation about the distance to the exit and the time required to reach it. He had taken 4 steps before Samuel Grant stepped forward from the back of the room. Samuel was 60 years old and had spent 30 of them managing the physical realities of a working estate. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who had made a decision well before this moment and simply waited for the right time to act on it. He placed himself between Fen and the door. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Two of the Barton Hall's own men, the host's staff, who had received a quiet word from Thomas Rowe before the evening began, appeared at the door behind Samuel. Fen stopped. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the people around him and performed, for a final few seconds, the expression of a wrongly accused man. Then he looked at Eleanor, and the performance ended. Caroline did not run. That was the difference between them, Eleanor would think later. The difference between Fen's panic and Caroline's cold calculation. Where Fen had moved for the exit, Caroline stood at the window and absorbed the room with the expression of a woman rapidly determining what damage could still be controlled. She turned to Eleanor. She said, with the composure of someone producing their final credible performance. "You have presented financial records and a letter that you claim is mine. You have made serious accusations in a public gathering. Whatever your personal grievances about your marriage, this has nothing to do with my marriage," Eleanor said, "except that my marriage was used as a vehicle for the transfer of my family's land." She held Caroline's gaze. "Everything on that table is documented. Everything on that table is verifiable. And the people in this room are not strangers to financial records or estate management." She paused. "They will verify it themselves. You know they will." Caroline looked around the room, and Eleanor watched her do it, watched her read the faces, the posture, the quality of the silence, and watched her understand what Eleanor had understood 3 weeks ago in Clara's sitting room. There was no version of this evening that ended with Caroline managing the story. The story had already left her hands. Something happened to Caroline's face then. Not collapse, not the theatrical crumbling of a villain caught at last. Something quieter, and in its own way, more devastating. The careful, constructed performance of the past 3 years simply stopped. For one unguarded moment, Eleanor saw underneath it. A woman who had spent her whole life understanding that wealth and reputation were the only protections that actually held, who had watched both slip through her fingers once already when her husband died, who had made the decision that she would never be unprotected again, no matter what it cost. It was, Eleanor thought, not entirely incomprehensible. It was also entirely wrong. "Mrs. Beaumont," Eleanor said, and her voice was quieter now, for the two of them more than the room. "I'm not asking you to confess in front of these people. I'm not asking you to do anything tonight, except understand that it's over." A pause. "Thomas Rowe has already filed the documentation with the Commonwealth's legal office. What happens from here is no longer in either of our hands." Caroline looked at her. "You could have ruined me privately," she said. "You didn't have to do it here." "You accused me here," Eleanor said simply. Not with anger, just fact. Caroline closed her eyes. She opened them. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. Not quickly, not slowly, with the preserved dignity of a woman who understood that the manner of her exit was the last thing she could control. She left. The room breathed. Nathaniel had been standing 10 feet from Eleanor through the entire exchange. She had been aware of him in the way she had become aware of the room's temperature, not looking directly, but registering. He had stood completely still for 40 minutes and said not a single word, and she understood that this had cost him more than anything else she could have asked. She turned to him now. He was looking at the documents on the table. His jaw was set in the particular way it went when he was holding himself together through effort rather than ease. Then he looked at her. 3 years, he said quietly. At minimum, she said. Possibly longer in its earlier phases. Fen. He said the name like he was weighing it. Yes. He ran one hand over the side of his face, the same gesture he'd made in Clara's sitting room, the gesture of a man confronting something too large to manage with composure. I brought him into my father's estate management when I was 19 years old, he said. He told my father, that he had our family's best interests at the center of his work. A pause. I believed him for 15 years. He was very careful, Eleanor said. He spent years being trustworthy in small things so that he could be trusted with larger ones. Nathaniel looked at her. You found it, he said. In 11 months. In the files you reorganized because no one else had time for them. He shook his head slowly. You found in 11 months what I missed in 15 years. I had time to look, she said, and no one expected me to be looking. A long pause. That's not an explanation, he said. That's a consequence of how I treated you. She met his eyes. He held her gaze with the steadiness that cost him something. She could see it costing him, this particular honesty, and she respected him more for not flinching from it. Yes, she said. It is. The room around them was moving now. Conversations breaking out. The Hargroves speaking with Thomas Rowe. Mrs. Holloway standing with two other women watching Fenn being quietly escorted by Samuel and the Barton staff toward a separate room where a county magistrate, summoned earlier in the day by Thomas Rowe's careful arrangement, was waiting. The business of consequence was beginning. Eleanor looked at it. She had built this. Every piece of it, methodically, from the wreckage of a night when she had been told to be small in front of 300 people. She had built it, and she felt. Not triumph, not exactly. Something more complicated and more real. The satisfaction of a thing done correctly. The exhaustion of someone who had been carrying weight for a very long time and could feel the moment approaching when she might be able to set some of it down. Nathaniel said, "What do you need now?" She looked at him. It was the same question he had asked in Clara's sitting room, and he had asked it the same way. Not as an offer of rescue, not as a reassertion of authority, but as a genuine question. What do you need? From me. That I can give, she thought. Time, she said. And honesty, from both of us. She paused. There is a great deal we have never said to each other, Nathaniel. We were married in a hurry, and we never quite found our way to the conversation underneath the arrangement. She looked at him directly. I would like to have that conversation. When I'm ready. When we're both ready. He nodded. And until then, he said. Until then, she said. I think I'll stay at Clara's a little longer. He was quiet for a moment. The Carter land, he said. Your family's parcels. I intend to see them returned. Whatever the legal process requires. Thomas Rowe knows what's needed, she said. He'll guide you through it. I will do it, he said. Whatever it requires. That was never... He stopped. He started again. Your father signed that contract in good faith. What was done to him was done because of my failure to see what was happening in my own house. A pause. That debt is mine to address. Eleanor held his gaze. She thought about her father. The handshake, the signed contract, the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed he had secured something real for his daughter's future. She thought about what it would mean to be able to tell him it was being made right. Thank you, she said. Not performed, not cautious, just true. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, Eleanor, I don't know if what I'm going to say is sufficient. I suspect it isn't, but I need to say it anyway. She waited. I have spent 15 years believing that the way I managed things was the right way, he said. That keeping everything controlled and steady and handled was the same as caring for it, for the estate, for the people in it. He paused. For you. He looked at the table, then back at her. I understand now that there is a difference between managing something and seeing it, between handling a person and knowing them. Another pause. I did not know you. I had a wife for 11 months, and I did not know her. And what she was doing while I was looking the other way was the only reason I still have anything left to stand in. The room was busy around them. No one was watching. It was, Eleanor thought, the most honest thing she had ever heard from him. She said, I know. 2 words. She did not soften them, and she did not harden them. She just let them stand where they were, real and uncomplicated. Nathaniel accepted them. He put on his hat. I'll leave you to finish what you came here to do, he said. You don't need me for the rest of it. I don't, she said. But... She stopped. He looked at her. I'm glad you came, she said. Something happened in his expression. Something that was not quite a smile, and not quite relief, but sat between the two, like a man who has walked a very long way and can finally see where he is going, even if he hasn't arrived yet. So am I, he said. He moved toward Thomas Rowe. Eleanor turned back to the room. Mrs. Holloway was at her shoulder within 30 seconds, and behind her 2 women Eleanor recognized from the Whitmore reception, and behind them the Hargroves, and behind them half a dozen more families who had been in that ballroom 6 weeks ago and had spent 6 weeks arranging their understanding of what they had witnessed. They were ready to rearrange it. Eleanor stood where she was and let them come. She answered every question clearly and without embellishment, because the facts were already extraordinary enough. She thanked Thomas Rowe and made sure Samuel Grant stood in the center of the acknowledgement rather than at the edge of it, because 30 years of loyal service deserved to be seen. She stayed until the end. She was the last woman in the room besides Clara, who had come with the Bartons' later arrivals and had said nothing and done nothing all evening except stand in the back of the room with her hands folded and watch her niece dismantle an injustice with the precision of a woman who had spent 4 months sharpening every tool she owned. When the room was nearly empty, Clara came to stand beside Eleanor. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Your mother would have cried through the whole thing." "I know," Eleanor said. "I nearly did," Clara said. Eleanor looked at her aunt, Clara, who did not cry. Clara, who had been self-sufficient since 30 and had no patience for sentiment and had shown her love for Eleanor in every way except the obvious ones. Clara, who had gray eyes that were currently brighter than usual. Eleanor took her aunt's hand. She held it. The room was quiet. Outside, the Virginia summer was full and warm and indifferent to what had just happened inside those walls, as summers always are, going on with their particular, unstoppable warmth, regardless of what the people beneath the sky were doing with their short and complicated lives. Eleanor held her aunt's hand and stood in the quiet room. She was not finished. There was still the legal process ahead. Still the recovery of the Carter land. Still the long, uncertain conversation with Nathaniel that neither of them had been ready to have yet. Still the work of rebuilding something from the ruins of a marriage that had never quite had the chance to become what it might have been. But the truth was in the room. It had been said out loud, in front of the people who mattered, by the person who had found it. And that was finished. That was done. And it was enough for tonight. The morning after Barton Hall, Eleanor slept until 9 o'clock. She did not wake before dawn. She did not go to the writing desk. She did not take inventory, or make lists, or map out what came next. She simply slept, and when she woke, the Virginia summer was already loud and warm outside Clara's window, and she lay still for a long time and let it be loud without needing to manage it. Clara knocked at 9:30 and came in with tea and set it on the side table and looked at Eleanor with the expression of someone who has watched a person carry an enormous thing for a very long time and is quietly glad to see them rest. "The county magistrate has Fenn," Clara said. "Thomas Rowe sent word this morning. He was taken to Richmond last night." Eleanor sat up. She reached for the tea. "And Caroline?" "No word yet. She left Barton Hall in her carriage, and Thomas believes she went directly home." Clara sat on the edge of the bed. "He doesn't think she'll run. He thinks she's too proud to run." "She is," Eleanor said. "Running would mean admitting it's over. Caroline will fight to the end of the process, because fighting is the only version of herself she knows how to be." She said it without bitterness. She had understood Caroline Beaumont better these past weeks than she had expected to. Not with sympathy. The understanding had not softened what Caroline had done, or the deliberateness with which she had done it. But Eleanor had looked long enough at the shape of Caroline's choices to see the fear underneath them. And fear, she had learned, was almost always the engine of the worst decisions people made. "What happens now?" Clara asked. "The legal process," Eleanor said. "Thomas will guide it. The Commonwealth will pursue the fraud charges. The Carter land recovery will go through the courts, but Thomas says the deed evidence is strong enough that it's a matter of timeline rather than outcome." She drank her tea. "And then," she paused, "and then Nathaniel and I have a conversation we've been building toward for a long time." Clara was quiet. "Are you ready for that?" she asked. Eleanor thought about it honestly. "No," she said, "but I don't think being ready is the requirement." She set down her cup. I think the requirement is being willing. And I am willing. Clara nodded. She stood up. She patted Eleanor's knee once, the gesture of a woman who had raised her love to the level of action rather than sentiment her whole life, and left the room. Eleanor looked at the window. She thought, one thing at a time. Today was for resting. Everything else could wait until tomorrow. It did not wait quite that long. Nathaniel came to Clara's house 3 days after Barton Hall. He sent no note ahead. He simply arrived, mid-morning, on horseback, and knocked at the front door with the particular knock of a man who is not certain of his welcome and is trying to signal both respect and urgency simultaneously. Clara opened the door and considered him for one long moment, and then stood aside. Eleanor was in the garden when Clara came to find her. Not working, just sitting in the chair near the herb beds with a book she hadn't been reading, her face tipped toward the warmth. "He's in the sitting room," Clara said. Eleanor closed the book. She took a moment. She smoothed her dress and stood and went inside. Nathaniel was standing when she came in. He had not sat, which she read immediately as a choice rather than an oversight. He was holding his hat in both hands, and he had the look of a man who had spent 3 days deciding what he was going to say and had arrived at the end of the preparation with no certainty it was adequate. "Eleanor," he said. "Nathaniel." She sat down across from where he was standing. She looked at him steadily. "Sit down." He sat. He set his hat on his knee. He looked at her with the open, undefended quality she had first seen in the study the morning she came back for the letter, the expression that had no performance in it. "I don't know how to start this," he said. "Then start in the middle," she said. "That's where it is anyway." Something moved through his expression, something like the beginning of a smile that decided it wasn't the right moment. "All right," he said. "The middle." He looked at his hat, then back at her. "I have been thinking about what you said at Barton Hall. Not the documents, not Fenn, or Caroline, or any of the legal specifics." He paused. "I've been thinking about the moment before any of it started, when you stood at the front of that room and the whole county was looking at you, and you were calm." He shook his head. "Not the calm of someone who has talked themselves out of being frightened. The calm of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and has known for a very long time." "I wasn't entirely calm," Eleanor said. "You looked it." "I've had practice appearing calm when I wasn't," she said. 11 months of it." He accepted that. He didn't flinch from it, and she registered the fact that he didn't. "I want to understand something," he said. "And I want you to answer me honestly, because I think I am past the point of being protected from honest answers." He met her eyes. "When you were at the manor, in those 11 months, were you unhappy, the whole of it? Or were there parts of it that were—" He stopped. I was asking, she understood, whether there had been anything real between them. Whether the 11 months had been entirely endurance, or whether something good had existed inside the difficulty. She thought about it. She thought about the evenings when the estate had been quiet, and she had sat in the library with a lamp and a good book, and felt, briefly, the comfort of a house that ran well because she ran it. She thought about the morning she had reorganized the filing system and experienced the deep, specific satisfaction of bringing order to chaos. She thought about the conversations at dinner that had occasionally veered from business into something more. Moments when Nathaniel had been, briefly, curious about her opinion, and she had given it, and he had listened. She thought about the hope she had carried. Even misplaced hope had been something to carry. "There were parts of it that weren't unhappy," she said carefully. "I am not going to tell you the whole 11 months was suffering, because that isn't true, and because it wouldn't be fair." She paused. "But there was a version of that life that was only barely enough. And a person cannot live on barely enough indefinitely and remain the same person they were when they started." He nodded slowly. "Who were you," he said, "when you started?" She looked at him. "Younger," she said simply. "More patient with uncertainty. More willing to wait for things to improve on their own." She paused. "I think I was waiting for you to choose me. And I gave that a great deal of time." Nathaniel held her gaze. I didn't, he said. Choose you. No. Not in the way that mattered. No. He was quiet. Then, I want to try. The sitting room was very still. I know what that sounds like, he said quickly. I know it sounds like what a man says when he's been backed against a wall and wants his life to return to normal. I know I have no right to your trust and no way to demand your time or your... He stopped. He ran a hand over his face. I am not asking you to come back tomorrow. I'm not asking you to pretend that what happened at the reception didn't happen, or that 11 months of what it was, can be corrected with a conversation. He looked at her directly. I am asking you to believe that I understand, for the first time, what it would actually mean to see you, and that I want to learn to do it. Eleanor listened to all of this. She sat with it. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, the woman who would have wept with relief at these words, who would have forgiven everything instantly and completely, because forgiveness felt like the opposite of being alone. She was not that woman anymore. She did not know whether to be glad about that. Nathaniel, she said, I need to ask you something. Anything, he said. Do you know why you didn't see me? In those 11 months. She held his gaze. Not what got in the way, not Fen, or the estate, or the business of managing a household. Do you know why, specifically, honestly, you looked at me and saw something less than what I was? He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She did not fill the silence. Finally he said, because I was afraid. She hadn't expected that. She waited. My father managed everything by controlling it, he said slowly. The estate, the household, every relationship he had. He kept things at a distance that made them safe. He looked at his hands. I grew up understanding that the way you protect something is to keep it managed, organized, running properly. A pause. A wife, in that understanding, is part of the household. Something to be managed well and appreciated for functioning as it should. He shook his head. I know how that sounds. I know how it felt, she said. Yes, he said. I imagine you do. Another pause. But the truth underneath it, the thing I didn't understand until I stood in your aunt's sitting room and watched you lay out 4 months of work, I hadn't known existed, is that what I was really afraid of was a person I couldn't control. Someone with her own intelligence and her own will and her own way of seeing things that might be different from mine. He looked at her. And you were, from the very beginning, exactly that person. Eleanor held his gaze. So you kept me at a distance, she said. So I kept you at a distance, he said. Because it was safer. Because it was what I knew. The room held the weight of this. Eleanor thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about Clara, who had spent 40 years alone and made something complete out of it. She thought about Samuel, who had given 30 years of loyalty to a family that had rarely thought to look at what it cost him. She thought about her father's signature on a fraudulent contract, and about the 40 Carter acres, and about the morning she had stood on the gravel drive in the summer dark, and understood that she had been waiting for someone else to decide her worth. She said, I cannot go back to what it was. I know, he said. I mean that completely, she said. The version of that marriage, the version where I manage the household and organize the accounts and keep everything running and receive nothing in return but the privilege of proximity, that is over. I will not return to it under any circumstances. I understand, he said. Do you? She looked at him steadily. Because I need you to understand it not as a condition I'm setting, but as a fact I'm stating. I know my own value now. I did not know it 11 months ago. I know it now, and I will not unknow it for the sake of convenience. Something happened in his face, not resistance, but something like recognition. The expression of a man hearing a truth that answers a question he has been asking for weeks without knowing how to form it. That is, he said quietly, the woman I should have been looking at all along. Silence. Eleanor breathed. Then she said, I'm not ready to come home. He nodded. But I am willing, she said, to find out whether there is something worth building between us. From where we actually are, rather than from where we should have been. She paused. That will take time. It will require honesty from both of us in ways that will not always be comfortable. And it will require you to understand that I am not a project to be managed or a problem to be solved. I am a person who has opinions and findings and plans, and I expect them to be treated as such. Yes, he said simply. Every time, she said. Not just when it's convenient. Yes, he said again. She looked at him. She thought, he means it today. Today he means every word of it. She also thought, the question is who he is on the ordinary days. The days when nothing dramatic is at stake and old habits want to settle back in. She did not know the answer to that yet, but she was, she realized, willing to find out. And that was something she had not expected to feel. Tepeg. She told him that before he left. She walked with him to the front of Clara's house, and he stopped at the door and turned to her, and she said, I didn't expect to be willing. He looked at her. I spent 3 weeks building the case for Barton Hall, she said, and I told myself the whole time that what I was doing was about justice, and about the Carter land, and about making certain Fen and Caroline face the consequences of what they'd done. She paused. All of that was true, but there was something else underneath it that I didn't look at directly until last night. What? He said. I was also, she said, hoping you were worth being honest with. He was very still. I couldn't have done any of it, she said. If I had already given up on you entirely, I would have taken what I had to a different county and started a different life and let the whole of the Whitmore estate deal with its own consequences. She held his gaze. I didn't do that. Why? He said. She thought about this. She thought about the morning she had found the first letter, 7 months ago, in the back of a ledger. She thought about the cold, particular fear of a woman who has discovered that the ground beneath the people she is tied to has been eaten through, and the choice she had made, in that moment, about what to do with what she knew. Because somewhere under the 11 months, she said, I still believed you were a better man than you were showing me. A pause. I wanted to give that man a chance to exist. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. He said, I'm going to try to be him. Not a promise with flourishes, not the grand declaration of a man performing transformation. Just a quiet statement of intent from someone who understood, finally, what the work actually required. Good, Eleanor said. He put his hat on. He left. Eleanor stood at Clara's door and watched the horse move down the lane until it was gone. And she stood there a moment longer in the summer warmth, with her hands at her sides, and her breathing steady, and the particular sensation of a woman who has set down something heavy and is only now beginning to feel the relief of her own arms. The legal process, as Thomas Rowe had predicted, was a matter of timeline. Aldrich Fenn was formally charged in Richmond within the week. The Commonwealth's case was built substantially on the documents Eleanor had assembled. The financial records, the deed transfer, the shell company, and the Philadelphia account, whose existence had surprised even Fenn when it was introduced as evidence, telling Eleanor that he had genuinely not anticipated anyone finding it. The shell company's assets were frozen. The Carter land transfer was challenged in the county deeds court, and within 6 weeks had been formally reversed. 40 acres returned to the Whitmore estate ledger with an official notation of fraudulent execution. Thomas Rowe filed the additional papers that would return the Carter parcels to their rightful standing in the marriage agreement. Eleanor's father was told. She told him herself, traveling to her family home one Thursday morning in late August, sitting across from him in the parlor where she had grown up, and laying it out simply and without softening it. He listened with the stillness of a man who has suspected for a long time that something was wrong and has been afraid to look directly at what it might be. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You did all of this. With Thomas Rowe," she said, "and Samuel, and Clara." "But you found it," he said. "Yes." He looked at his hands. He was not a man who cried easily. He was a man who had managed difficulty all his life with the same steady, practical composure that Eleanor now recognized she had inherited rather than learned. But his voice, when he spoke again, was different. "I signed that contract believing I was doing right by you," he said. "I believed I had secured something solid for you. You did what you could with what you knew," she said. "It wasn't enough." "Papa." She reached across and put her hand over his. "It wasn't your failure. It was theirs. The only thing you did was trust that a contract meant what it said." She paused. "That is not a fault. That is what a contract is supposed to mean." He looked at her. He covered her hand with his other hand and held it. He said, "Are you all right?" And Eleanor, who had been braced, calm, organized, and precisely controlled for 4 months, felt something crack open at the question. Not dramatically. Just the small, internal fracture of a woman who had been asking herself that same question in the dark for a long time and had not allowed herself to answer it. "Yes," she said. She meant it. She was also, she recognized, still in the process of becoming it. "I'm going to be," she said. "That's the truest version." Her father nodded. He held her hand. They sat like that for a while, in the quiet of the parlor, while the late August heat pressed against the windows and the summer tipped gradually toward its end. Caroline Beaumont's legal proceedings moved more slowly. She had, as Eleanor had predicted, retained counsel and was fighting every element of the case with the precision of a woman who had spent 3 years thinking about contingencies. Thomas Rowe had told Eleanor not to expect a quick resolution. Caroline was not Fenn, who had broken quickly once he understood that the Philadelphia account had been found. Caroline was constructed of different material. She would hold to the end of the process. Eleanor followed the proceedings, but did not obsess over them. She had given what she had. The rest was the law's work, and the law moved at its own pace, regardless of how urgently justice required it. What she focused on, in those final weeks of summer, was herself. It was strange work. Stranger, in some ways, than the financial mapping had been. At least the accounts had clear numbers and definite patterns, and an endpoint when everything balanced. The work of figuring out who she was outside of what she had been managing was more ambiguous, more uncomfortable, and significantly more necessary. She started with small things. She began reading in the evenings again, not to occupy herself, but because she wanted to. She walked in the mornings with no destination and let herself arrive wherever the walk took her. She spent an afternoon with Clara going through old correspondence and found, in letters she had written years before the marriage, a woman who had opinions about literature and strong feelings about land management, and a sense of humor she had buried somewhere inside 11 months of careful social navigation. She had not lost her. She had just set her aside for a while. She picked her back up. Nathaniel wrote to her twice in August. The letters were different from the ones he had sent during the first weeks after the reception. Different in kind, not just in tone. Those letters had been the letters of a man managing a problem. These were the letters of a man who was, slowly and imperfectly and with visible effort, trying to learn a different way of doing things. The first letter talked about Samuel. "I have asked Samuel Grant to take on a formal role in the estate management, a title and a wage that reflect what he has actually been doing for 30 years. He said yes, and then told me I was 30 years late in asking. I told him he was right. He seemed satisfied with that." Eleanor read this and felt something warm and uncomplicated, which was rarer than it should have been. The second letter was shorter. "I went through the library last week. The organizational system you put in place is the only reason I can find anything. I've been relying on it for 11 months and I never once said so. I'm saying so now." She wrote back to both. Brief, honest letters. Not warm exactly, not yet, but real. The beginning of a correspondence between two people who were learning, in writing, to say true things to each other. It was something. It was, possibly, the beginning of something. She went back to Whitmore Manor on a Saturday morning in early September. Not because she had decided everything was resolved. Not because the conversation was finished, or the rebuilding was complete, or any of the things that would need to be true before she could say, fully and without reservation, that the marriage was repaired. She went because she chose to. That was the difference. Everything that had happened, the 11 months of barely enough, the night of the reception, the 4 months of methodical, invisible work, the legal proceedings, the slow relearning of who she was outside of what other people needed from her. All of it had brought her to a woman who went back to Whitmore Manor, not because she had to, but because she had decided to. She came up the main drive this time, not the back lane, not the servant's entrance, not the practical, unannounced approach of a woman trying not to be seen. The front. Nathaniel was on the steps when she arrived. She didn't know whether someone had told him she was coming, or whether he had simply been in the habit, these past weeks, of watching the drive. She didn't ask. He came down the steps when the carriage stopped. He opened the door himself. He offered his hand. She took it and stepped down. They stood in front of the house she had managed and organized and kept running for 11 months without being seen, and looked at each other in the early September light. "You came back," he said. "I came back," she said. A pause. "Are you?" he started. "I'm here," she said. "Let's start with that." He nodded. They walked inside together. Samuel was in the corridor, and he looked at Eleanor with an expression she had not seen on him before, a fullness in it, something that had room for more than the careful, observant neutrality he had worn for 30 years. Something that was, she recognized, the face of a man who was no longer managing his hope. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Samuel," she said. "I hear you have a new title." "I hear the same," he said. She held out her hand. He shook it. Not the formal way, not the careful way, but as one person who has been through something significant with another person and has reached the other side of it. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "You did the work," he said. You saw me," she said simply, "when almost no one else did. That mattered more than you know." He looked at her. His jaw moved briefly. He said, "Welcome home, ma'am." She walked through the house. She did it slowly and deliberately, not because she was checking on things or assessing what needed doing. She had spent enough of her life assessing what needed doing, but because she wanted to know how it felt. Whether it felt different, whether the house itself had changed, or whether she had, or whether it was both. The rooms were the same. The smell was the same. The particular quality of light in the library at this hour was exactly as she remembered it. But she moved through it differently, not managing, not organizing, just present. She stopped at the library window and looked out at the Virginia fields stretching south and east under the September sky. The summer heat had broken slightly, the first suggestion of autumn in the quality of the light, and the fields were green gold at this hour, in a way that had no name but that she had always found, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, to be the particular color of the kind of peace that is hard won rather than given. Nathaniel came to stand beside her, not close enough to be presumptuous, close enough to be honest. "I've been thinking about something you said," he said, "at Clara's house, about the version of this marriage that was barely enough." She waited. "I don't want that version," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Not for your sake, though I understand what it cost you, and I understand I owe you an accounting for that which will take considerably longer than a conversation." He looked at her profile. "But for my own sake as well, because I spent 15 years managing things at a careful distance, and I thought that was strength, and I understand now it was the opposite." He paused. "I would like to try to do things differently. Not because I've learned a lesson and the lesson is complete, but because I want to keep learning it." Eleanor looked at the fields. She thought about what it meant to stay. She thought about all the ways staying could go wrong, and all the ways it had gone wrong already, and the reality that no amount of evidence or legal proceedings or hard-won self-knowledge could guarantee her that the next 11 months would not simply be another version of the first. She thought about the woman who had walked out of the Whitmore ballroom with nothing but a notebook full of figures and an unfinished fury and more courage than she had known she possessed. That woman had learned, in the month since, to be the person in the room who held the truth. She was not going to give that up for anyone. Not even for the version of Nathaniel that was standing beside her now, trying, imperfectly and visibly, to become someone new. "I want something from you," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I want a seat at the table," she said. "Not as a wife who is consulted when convenient. As a partner who is involved in the management of this estate from the beginning of every decision." She turned to look at him. "My understanding of these accounts is better than yours. That is not a criticism. It is a fact. And it would be a significant waste to have that knowledge in this household and not use it." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "Every decision," she said. "Every significant matter. I am not interested in being informed after the fact." "Yes," he said again. "And when we disagree, we discuss it," he said. "You tell me I'm wrong if you think I'm wrong. I tell you the same. And we arrive at something together." He paused. "I understand that is not how I've operated. I understand it will require adjustment." A beat. "I intend to make the adjustment." Eleanor looked at him. She thought, today he means it. She also thought, I am different enough now that I will know when he doesn't. And I will say so. That was the thing that had changed. Not Nathaniel, or not only Nathaniel. Not the marriage, not the house, not the fields outside the window. She had changed. She had walked out of this house as a woman who had been asking permission to be seen, and she had come back as a woman who did not need permission from anyone. That was the real victory. Not Barton Hall, not the legal proceedings, not even the return of the Carter land, though that mattered deeply. The real victory was standing in the library of Whitmore Manor in September light, with the full knowledge of her own worth, choosing to be here, not because she had no other option, but because she had weighed every option and decided this one was worth fighting for. "All right," she said. 2 words. Nathaniel let out a breath. Slow, careful, the breath of a man who has been holding more than he realized. "All right," he said. He offered his arm. She took it. They turned from the window together and walked back into the house. Not the house it had been. Not the house of 11 months of barely enough. Not the house of managed distances and unspoken truths and a woman invisible in her own hallways. A different house, one that had been through something real and had come out the other side with the kind of clarity that only arrives after the hardest things are said out loud. Clara visited the following week. She came for dinner and stayed 2 hours and observed everything with the sharp, comprehensive attention of a woman who had spent 70 years watching how people treated each other in the ordinary moments that mattered more than the dramatic ones. After dinner, when Nathaniel had excused himself and Clara and Eleanor sat alone in the parlor with their tea, Clara said, "He listened to you at dinner." "He did," Eleanor said, not waiting to respond, actually listening. "I noticed." Clara held her cup. "That's not nothing," she said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "It isn't. It isn't everything either." "No," Eleanor said. "It isn't that." They sat with the honest middle of it. The place that wasn't resolution and wasn't failure. The place that was simply 2 people beginning the long, imperfect, necessary work of learning to do things right. Clara set down her cup. She looked at her niece across the parlor. "You know what I think?" she said. "I usually do," Eleanor said. "I think," Clara said, "that the person who walked out of that ballroom in June had no idea what she was capable of." Eleanor was quiet. "I think she had spent so long making herself small," Clara continued, "that she had genuinely forgotten there was more of her than what she was showing." She paused. "And I think the past 3 months were not just about the estate, or the fraud, or even the marriage." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "I think they were about a woman remembering who she was." The parlor was quiet. Eleanor held her aunt's gaze. She thought about the June night on the gravel drive, standing in the dark with no bag and no plan and nothing but the clarity of a woman who has finally run out of patience with her own invisibility. She thought about the notebook. The 12 pages of figures. The letter in Caroline's handwriting. The morning ride to the manor. Thomas Rowe's expression when she put the deed on the table. Samuel's hand on the study doorframe. Nathaniel's face in the sitting room when he finally understood what had been done under his name and who had been paying attention. She thought about her father's hands over hers in the parlor of her childhood home. She thought about all the ordinary mornings and quiet evenings, and small, unseen choices that had built the woman who walked into Barton Hall and said the truth out loud, without flinching. "Yes," she said. "I think that's right." Clara nodded. She stood up. She patted Eleanor's shoulder once, the same gesture she had made the morning she told Eleanor to stop being careful about the wrong things, and she went to collect her things and say her goodbyes. Eleanor stayed in the parlor. She sat in the quiet of Whitmore Manor, with the September evening pressing soft against the windows, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was its own remarkable luxury. She thought, "I did not lose my life in that ballroom." She thought, "I found it." And she thought, with the clear, unshakable certainty of a woman who has been through the worst of it and come out the other side standing on her own feet, no one will ever make her forget that again. Not a husband, not a social gathering, not a room full of people waiting to see if she would bend. She knew who she was now. She had earned that knowledge the hard way, which was the only way that knowledge like that ever truly held. Eleanor Whitmore sat in her parlor in the September light, and she was not waiting for anything. She was exactly where she had chosen to be.